The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the weathered farmhouse, its rays reflecting off the metal roof with an intensity that would make most men retreat indoors. But James Iron Harmon stood unflinching on his porch, squinting across his property with eyes that had stared down far worse than harsh sunlight. At 68, his frame remained imposingly solid, though time had etched deep lines into his face and turned his once coal-black hair to steel gray. The summer of 2023 marked 32 years since Operation Desert Storm, where Harmon had commanded an M60 Patton tank across the sands of Iraq. The memories remained as vivid as the day they were forged in the crucible of combat. He could still smell the diesel fuel, feel the rumble of the engine beneath him, hear the metallic clank of the breech closing. Inside his study, a half-finished memoir waited on an ancient desktop computer. 400 pages of his life laid bare, yet somehow the most important parts remained unwritten. Harmon took a final drag from his cigarette before crushing it beneath his boot. The doctor had told him to quit 15 years ago. The way Harmon saw it, any man who survived 3 wars and 2 heart attacks had earned the right to enjoy his vices. The sound of tires on gravel drew his attention to the long driveway leading up to the house. A military-issue Jeep approached, kicking up dust that hung in the air like a signal flare. Harmon's face softened as he recognized the vehicle. His son Daniel had promised to visit this weekend, fresh off his promotion to captain in the 1st Armored Division. The old tanker's chest swelled with pride at the thought. 3 generations of Harmons had served in armor units, a family legacy of steel and courage. Daniel exited the vehicle with the disciplined movements of a career soldier. At 35, he was the spitting image of Harmon in his youth, though without the hardness around the eyes that came from seeing too much death. They embraced briefly, masculine affection expressed through firm pats on the back rather than words. "How was the drive?" Harmon asked as they walked toward the house. "Long, hot, pretty much what you'd expect in Texas in July," Daniel replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "Mom called, by the way. She wanted me to remind you about dinner next weekend." Harmon grunted in acknowledgement. 20 years divorced, and Margaret still managed to coordinate his social calendar. Some battlefield maneuvers were simpler than navigating ex-wife diplomacy. Inside, the house felt cavernous and cool, decades of military precision evident in its Spartan organization. Framed photos lined the hallway, chronicling Harmon's career from a fresh-faced West Point graduate to a decorated colonel. Among the family portraits and official photographs stood one image that seemed out of place, a faded picture of Harmon standing beside a Soviet officer in front of a T-62 tank. Both men looked uncomfortable but determined, like reluctant dancers following a choreography neither had chosen. Daniel had seen the photo countless times throughout his childhood, but his father had never explained it. Today, something compelled him to ask. "You know, Dad, you've never told me the full story behind this picture." Harmon paused, his hand instinctively going to the small scar above his right eyebrow. "Some stories take a long time to find their ending, son." Before Daniel could press further, the landline telephone rang, its harsh bell an anachronism in the age of smartphones. Harmon moved to answer it with surprising quickness for a man his age. Few people called that number anymore. "Harmon," he answered, military brevity never quite leaving him. The voice on the other end spoke briefly. Harmon's expression remained impassive, but Daniel noticed his father's knuckles whitening as he gripped the receiver. "I understand. Thank you for letting me know." Harmon hung up without saying goodbye. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked, concern evident in his voice. Harmon stood motionless for a moment, staring at nothing. "That was Thomas Miller. You remember Eagle Eye?" Daniel nodded. His father's former gunner had been a fixture at family barbecues throughout his childhood, famous for his ability to spot a deer at extraordinary distances and his boisterous laugh. Viktor Sokolov died yesterday, heart attack. The name meant nothing to Daniel, but clearly carried weight for his father, who moved to his liquor cabinet and poured 2 fingers of bourbon. He drank it straight, without ceremony. "Who was Sokolov?" Daniel finally asked. "A Soviet tank commander. Later Russian, I suppose, after everything fell apart over there." Harmon's voice was flat, controlled. "We had an encounter during the Cold War. He was T-62 crew. I was M-60. We became acquaintances afterward under unusual circumstances." Daniel sensed that there was vastly more to the story, but his father's expression discouraged further questions. Instead, he watched as Harmon moved to his desk and unlocked the bottom drawer with a key he kept on his chain. From within, he withdrew a small wooden box that Daniel had never seen before. Miller mentioned something else, Harmon said quietly. Sokolov left something for me with the Russian embassy. They forwarded it to the State Department, and I should receive it in a few days, but I already know what it is. He opened the box, revealing a collection of handwritten letters, their paper yellowed with age. The envelopes bore Russian stamps from various decades, addressed in precise Cyrillic script. "You've been corresponding with a Soviet officer all these years?" Daniel asked, unable to mask his surprise. "I didn't think that was allowed during the Cold War." "It wasn't," Harmon replied simply. He lifted the letters carefully, revealing a small object beneath them, a tarnished brass tank commander's compass with Cyrillic markings. "We found our own channels. Sometimes the right thing and the allowed thing aren't the same." Harmon closed the box and returned it to the drawer, locking it decisively. But as he turned, the familiar ping of an email notification sounded from his computer. With a slight frown, he moved to check it. Few people had this address either. The email contained no message, only an attachment. Harmon opened it to reveal a scanned letter, handwritten in the same precise script as the envelopes in his box, but the ink was fresh, the paper unwrinkled. A letter written recently, before its author's death. As Harmon read, his expression changed from curiosity to something Daniel couldn't quite identify. Concern? Shock? Resolution? "Son, I think it's time I told you a story about a Cold War that nearly turned hot, about two enemies who realized they were fighting for the same thing from opposite sides." He took a deep breath. "And about why some secrets need to stay buried until the right time comes to dig them up." Daniel settled into the worn leather chair across from his father. The afternoon light slanted through the window blinds, casting dramatic shadows across Harmon's weathered face. "It started in 1980 along the border between East and West Germany. I was a young lieutenant then, commanding an M60A3. Chapter 2, flashback. East-West German border 1980. The smell hit him first. Always the smell. Diesel fuel, gun oil, and the metallic tang of cold steel. Lieutenant James Harmon inhaled deeply as he climbed aboard his M60A3 Patton tank, appreciating the familiar sense that had become as much a part of him as his own skin. The morning air along the East German border carried the bite of early frost, the kind that settled into your bones and reminded you that comfort was a luxury rarely afforded to tankers. Harmon's tank, dubbed Steel Justice, sat waiting like a patient predator, 52 tons of American industrial might. The crew had already been through their morning checks, a ballet of precision they could perform half asleep. Thomas Eagle Eye Miller, the gunner, was cleaning the optical sights with meticulous care. Nobody in the battalion could match his accuracy at range. Sergeant Robert Doc Rodriguez, the loader, was organizing the ammunition stowage, his movements economical and precise, belying the strength needed to handle the heavy shells. Private William Speedy Johnson, the driver, was performing his usual ritual of talking softly to the engine as he checked the oil levels. "You sweet-talking my tank again, Speedy?" Harmon called out as he settled into the commander's position, adjusting his helmet. "Just promising her I'll treat her gentle, sir," Johnson replied with a grin that hadn't dimmed despite months of border patrols. "She likes the attention." "Well, she better be in the mood for a long patrol today." Intelligence reports increased activity across the line. Harmon's voice shifted from casual to professional in an instant. His crew responded in kind, their movements becoming more focused. The radio crackled to life. "All judgment units, this is judgment actual. Final briefing in 15 minutes. Acknowledged over." One by one, the tank commanders of Bravo Company acknowledged the order. Harmon responded last, taking a final moment to scan the horizon with his binoculars. Somewhere beyond the visible border, he knew Soviet T-62 tanks were doing the same routine, their crews preparing for another day of the elaborate chess game that was the Cold War. Inside the command tent, Captain Richards stood before a map of the border region, red pins indicating known Soviet positions, blue pins showing their own. The latest intelligence photographs were tacked alongside, showing increased movement of armor and the distinctive silhouettes of T-62 tanks. "Gentlemen, SIGINT picked up unusual radio chatter last night. Soviet armor units are conducting exercises 15 kilometers from the border here and here." Richards indicated the positions with a pointer. "Normally we wouldn't be concerned, but these exercises weren't on any of their published schedules, and they've brought in units from outside the normal border forces." Harmon studied the photographs intently. The T-62 had become something of an obsession for him. He'd memorized every detail of its capabilities, from its 115mm smoothbore gun to its Christie suspension system. In many ways, it was the Soviet counterpart to his beloved M60, both evolutionary designs that built upon proven platforms, both workhorses of their respective armies. Our mission today is strictly observation, Richards continued. First platoon will patrol Sector Alpha, second platoon takes Bravo. Lieutenant Harmon, your third platoon will cover Charlie Sector with special attention to this valley. Satellite imagery suggests they may be moving additional armor through it under canopy cover. Harmon nodded, already mapping the terrain in his mind. Charlie Sector included a deep forest where visual confirmation would be challenging. They would need to rely more on sound and instinct than optics. One final note, Richard said, his voice dropping slightly. Washington is particularly interested in any sign of the T-62 Model 1972 with the DROSD active protection system. Intelligence suggests they may be field testing it in this region. If confirmed, it would represent a significant advancement in their defensive capabilities. The briefing concluded with the usual reminders about rules of engagement and communication protocols. As the commanders dispersed to their units, Major Adams, the battalion XO, called Harmon aside. Lieutenant Captain Richards specifically requested your platoon for Charlie Sector because of your familiarity with Soviet armor. If anyone can spot something unusual about these T-62s, it's you. Harmon acknowledged the implicit compliment with a nod. We'll keep our eyes open, sir. I know you will. Just remember, observation only. The last thing we need is an international incident. Adams' tone carried a warning edge. Some of the higher-ups are concerned you might be a little too enthusiastic about getting close to Soviet armor. Harmon met the major's gaze evenly. I understand the mission parameters, sir. Adams held his gaze for a moment longer before nodding. Dismissed. Back at the tank, Harmon briefed his crew on their assignment. Miller looked particularly pleased at the prospect of potentially spotting a new Soviet tank variant. Rodriguez seemed indifferent, methodically checking the ammunition one final time. Johnson was already in his driver's compartment, running the engine at idle. Eagle Eye, pay special attention to any T-62 with unusual antenna configurations or extra equipment housings on the turret, Harmon instructed. The DROSD system uses radar to detect incoming projectiles, so there should be visible external components. Got it, Lieutenant, Miller replied, adjusting his gunner's sight. I'll spot them if they're there. Harmon smiled at his gunner's confidence. Thomas Miller had earned his nickname through an uncanny ability to identify enemy armor at extreme ranges. The son of a Kentucky hunting guide, he claimed he could spot a deer's ear twitching at 1,000 yards before he could even shave. Whether that was true or not, his skills with the tank's optical systems were unmatched in the battalion. The order to move out came at precisely 0700 hours. The tanks of Bravo Company rumbled to life in sequence, their powerful engines sending vibrations through the ground. Harmon felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as Steel Justice lurched forward, the massive vehicle responding to Johnson's expert touch at the controls. The border zone stretched before them, a no-man's land of tension and restraint. To their east lay the territory of the German Democratic Republic, the front line of Soviet influence in Europe. The physical border itself was marked by fences, guard towers, and carefully maintained clearing zones designed to eliminate concealment for potential defectors from the east. Beyond that visible line lay another world, one governed by different ideologies, but populated by men not so different from themselves. Harmon had always found that thought disturbing. Somewhere across that arbitrary line, a Soviet tank commander was likely contemplating the same philosophical quandary while watching for American tanks. Their patrol route took them through undulating terrain, a mix of open fields and dense forests that offered both excellent observation points and dangerous blind spots. Harmon directed Johnson to position them on a wooded ridge overlooking a valley that intelligence believed might serve as a concealed movement corridor for Soviet armor. Cut the engine, Speedy, Harmon ordered as they reached an ideal vantage point. Eagle Eye, let's see what's moving out there. The sudden silence as the engine died was always disorienting, like a heartbeat suddenly stopping. The tank became a stationary observation post, its crew scanning the valley below with practiced precision. Hours passed with little activity. They observed routine movements of East German border guards, logged the scheduled patrol of a Soviet UAZ-469 utility vehicle, and noted the distant rumble of what might have been tank engines, though too far to make visual confirmation. By mid-afternoon, the monotony had settled in. Rodriguez was quietly recounting a story about his grandfather's ranch in Arizona, while Johnson seemed to be fighting off sleep in the driver's compartment. Even Miller's legendary concentration appeared to be flagging. Then the radio crackled. All judgment units be advised. SIGINT reports increased radio traffic in your sectors. Possible armor movement imminent. Maintain positions and report any visual confirmation. Judgment actual out. The crew snapped back to full alertness. Harmon raised his binoculars again, scanning the valley methodically. For 20 minutes, nothing changed. Then Miller spotted it first, as usual. Movement. 2 o'clock, edge of the tree line, he reported calmly. Mechanical, not animal. Harmon shifted his focus. At first, he saw nothing. Then a shadow moved in a way nature never intended. The straight lines and angular surfaces of man-made machinery briefly visible among the trees. I see it. Good eye, Eagle. Harmon kept his binoculars fixed on the spot. Rodriguez, get ready to record. Johnson, kill all unnecessary systems. Silent running. More movement followed. The unmistakable profile of a T-62 tank emerged partially from the forest cover, then another, and another. They were moving in a tight formation, using the trees for concealment while traversing the valley. Count 4 T-62s, Miller updated. Standard configuration from what I can see. Harmon studied the tanks carefully. They were indeed the familiar T-62 model that had been the backbone of Soviet armor forces for years. Nothing unusual about their appearance or movement pattern. Then a fifth tank emerged, trailing slightly behind the others. Its silhouette was similar, but not identical to the standard T-62. Additional equipment housings were visible on the turret, and unusual antenna arrays extended from its rear deck. There, Harmon whispered, though there was no need for silence inside their own tank. That's different. Eagle Eye, can you get a clear image? Miller was already adjusting the optical equipment. On it, sir, magnifying now. The modified T-62 kept to the shadows, as if its crew were aware of their special status and the need for discretion. It moved deliberately, maintaining greater distance from the tree line than its companions. That's it, Harmon said with quiet certainty. That's the Drozd equipment variant. Look at the radar panels on the turret face, and those housings along the sides must contain the countermeasure launchers. Miller recorded everything through the optical system, capturing the evidence they needed. Harmon radioed their findings to company headquarters, keeping his report precise and unemotional despite the excitement he felt at confirming the new Soviet technology. Judgment 3-3 to Judgment Actual. Visual confirmation of 5 T-62s moving through Charlie Sector Valley. 4 standard configuration, 1 modified with suspected Drozd APS components. Transmitting optical data now. The response came immediately. Judgment Actual, copies all. Maintain observation, do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. As if there were any possibility they would fire across the border and start World War III. Harmon suppressed a snort at the unnecessary reminder. The Soviet tanks continued their traverse of the valley, eventually disappearing back into the forest on the far side. The entire observation had lasted less than 15 minutes. But Harmon knew they had witnessed something significant. The Drozd system represented a new chapter in the arms race, an active protection system capable of intercepting incoming anti-tank rounds before they struck their target. If deployed widely, it could potentially neutralize a key NATO advantage. Think they knew we were watching, sir? Johnson asked from his position. Probably, Harmon replied. They chose their route carefully, kept to cover as much as possible, but they also wanted us to see just enough. It's all part of the game. The game. That's what they called this constant posturing and technological one-upmanship. A game with civilization-ending consequences if anyone ever decided to play for real. As the day wore on, they observed 2 more movements of standard T-62 units, but the modified tank did not reappear. By the time dusk approached, they had compiled a detailed log of Soviet armor activity in the sector, including precise timing, routes, and equipment observations. The order to return to base came at 1900 hours. As Johnson fired up the engine and began the journey back, Harmon found himself contemplating the Soviet tank commander who had been entrusted with the modified T-62. Was he a decorated veteran or an ambitious young officer? Did he understand the significance of the technology he commanded? Did he have a family waiting for him somewhere in the vast expanse of the Soviet Union? Such thoughts were dangerous, Harmon knew. Humanizing the enemy could create hesitation, and hesitation got men killed in war. But they weren't at war, not technically. And sometimes understanding your opponent as a man rather than a faceless adversary provided insights that technical intelligence could not. Back at base, Harmon delivered his report to Captain Richards and Major Adams, who seemed particularly interested in the details of the modified T-62. "Good work, Lieutenant," Adams said after reviewing the optical recordings. "This confirms what intelligence has been suggesting. The Soviets are definitely field testing the DRAWS system in forward-deployed units." "What's our assessment of its capabilities, sir?" Harmon asked. Richards exchanged a glance with Adams before responding. "Current estimates suggest it could potentially intercept up to 80% of incoming heat rounds in its engagement envelope. It's designed specifically to counter shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons and older generation ATGMs. That would significantly reduce the effectiveness of our infantry anti-tank capabilities," Harmon noted. "Precisely why we needed this confirmation," Adams agreed. "Washington will want continued observation. Your platoon is being assigned extended patrol duties in Charlie Sector for the next 2 weeks." Harmon nodded, suppressing a smile. Extended observation of the new Soviet technology was exactly what he wanted. "We'll be ready, sir." Later that night, in the officers' quarters, Harmon updated his personal notebook with detailed observations of the modified T-62. His fascination with Soviet armor had begun as professional interest, but had evolved into something deeper, a respect for the engineering principles and the men who employed them. Understanding the enemy's equipment was crucial to defeating it if necessary, but also provided insight into their tactical thinking and priorities. As he sketched the antenna configuration he had observed, Lieutenant Parker from 2nd Platoon dropped into the chair across from him. "Heard you spotted the unicorn today," Parker said with a hint of envy. "Special T-62 with all the fancy gadgets. Just happened to be in the right place," Harmon replied modestly. "Bullshit. You've been studying those things like they're Playboy centerfolds. I bet you could identify a T-62 by the sound of its engine from 5 miles away." Harmon smiled but didn't deny it. "Know your enemy, Parker." "Yeah, well, while you're getting intimate with Soviet armor design, some of us are trying to maintain a social life. Group of us heading into town tomorrow night. You should come. There's this new bartender at the Hofbräuhaus who keeps asking about American officers." "Maybe next time," Harmon said, returning to his notes. "I've got patrol prep." Parker shook his head. "All work and no play, Harmon. The Cold War will still be cold next weekend." He departed with a friendly slap on Harmon's shoulder. Alone again, Harmon closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Parker wasn't wrong. He had been neglecting the social aspects of deployment, focusing almost exclusively on his professional duties. But something told him that the modifications he'd observed today were just the beginning of a new phase in the technological chess match between East and West. Sleep came fitfully that night, his dreams filled with the silhouettes of tanks moving through misty forests, always just out of clear view. Chapter 3. Facing the Enemy. Dawn arrived with the distinctive sound of rain on metal, a gentle patter that transformed the tank park into a symphony of tiny impacts. Lieutenant Harmon stood under the meager shelter of the command post's awning, steam rising from the coffee mug clutched in his hand. The weather forecast predicted continuous rain for the next 48 hours, complicating their observation mission, but potentially creating opportunities for closer approach under reduced visibility. Captain Richards confirmed as much during the morning briefing. "Intelligence wants us to push our observation post closer to the line today. The weather gives us cover for more forward deployment. 3rd Platoon will take point in Charlie Sector again." The briefing room map now showed several new red pins indicating increased Soviet presence along the border. Their modified T-62 had been spotted twice more by other observation posts, confirming that it was conducting extensive field exercises in the area. "Lieutenant Harmon, given your platoon's familiarity with the target, you'll advance to observation point Delta 7. Richards indicated a position much closer to the border than their previous day's location. It offers concealed approach and good elevation for observation into the valley. Just remember to maintain at least 200 meters distance from the actual border at all times." Harmon studied the map carefully. OPE Delta 7 was indeed well positioned, but it left them with minimal withdrawal routes if they were spotted. Still, the opportunity to observe the modified T-62 at closer range was worth the risk. "Understood, sir. We'll maintain proper distance from the line." Harmon's tone was professional, betraying none of the excitement he felt at the prospect of a closer look at the Soviet technology. The tanks moved out under a leaden sky, wipers working steadily against the persistent rainfall. Visibility was reduced to less than a kilometer in some areas. The landscape transformed into a monochromatic blur of grays and dark greens. For Johnson, the driver, these conditions demanded total concentration, the muddy terrain threatening to bog down even the mighty M60. They reached the vicinity of OP Delta 7 by mid-morning, using a narrow forest trail that showed minimal signs of recent use. Harmon directed Johnson to position the tank behind a dense copse of pines that provided both concealment and a stable firing platform, should the unthinkable happen. "Cut engine, passive observation mode," Harmon ordered once they were in position. The sudden silence was amplified by the steady drumming of rain on the tank's hull. Through his commander's viewport, Harmon could see the edge of East German territory approximately 300 meters away. The official border was marked by a cleared strip of land, fence posts, and occasional guard towers. Beyond that lay the valley where they had previously observed Soviet tank movements. "Eagle Eye, set up the long-range optics. I want continuous scanning of the valley approach." Harmon adjusted his own binoculars, focusing on the most likely routes of advance based on yesterday's observations. The hours passed slowly. The rain eventually tapered to a mild drizzle, improving visibility somewhat. They logged routine movements of border guards in a single UAZ patrol, but no armor activity. Rodriguez used the downtime to clean the breech of the main gun, while Johnson dozed in his compartment, years of military service having taught him to sleep whenever the opportunity presented itself. Shortly after noon, Miller spotted movement at the far end of the valley. Contact bearing 075, approximately 2 kilometers. Armor, moving slow. Harmon shifted his attention immediately. Through his binoculars, he could make out the distinctive profile of a T-62 emerging from the tree line. Unlike yesterday, it was moving alone. "Single vehicle," Harmon confirmed. "Get the optics on it. Let's see if it's our modified friend." Miller made the adjustments, the powerful observation equipment bringing the distant tank into clear focus. "Affirmative, sir. It's the Drozd'd-equipped variant, same antenna configuration and turret modules as yesterday." Harmon felt a surge of professional satisfaction. Their patience had paid off. "They're running a solo exercise," he noted as he observed the tank's movements, testing the system in isolation. "Rodriguez, wake Johnson up. I want the engine ready in case we need to reposition." The Soviet tank advanced deliberately through the valley, occasionally stopping to rotate its turret as if scanning for targets. It was a textbook demonstration of cautious advance in uncertain territory. Harmon found himself grudgingly admiring the crew's discipline. "Odd," Miller said after several minutes of observation. "They're moving closer to the border than usual, already past their normal exercise boundary." Harmon frowned, checking his map against the tank's position. Miller was right. The T-62 was now less than a kilometer from the border, well outside its authorized exercise area, according to intelligence briefings. "Judgment 3-3 to Judgment Actual," Harmon radioed. "Target vehicle operating unusually close to border, currently 1 kilometer east of line and closing. Request guidance." The response took longer than expected. "Judgment 3-3, maintain observation. Do not reveal your position unless directly threatened. Higher is monitoring the situation." Higher. That meant battalion command or beyond was watching this unfold in real time, likely through satellite imagery. Harmon acknowledged the order and returned to his observation. The T-62 continued its advance, now moving even more cautiously, almost as if searching for something. When it reached approximately 500 meters from the border, it suddenly stopped. Through the optical equipment, Harmon could see the commander emerge from the turret hatch, scanning the area with binoculars. "They're right at the edge of their permitted zone," Harmon murmured. "Any closer and they risk an international incident." As if hearing his words, the T-62 began to turn, seemingly preparing to withdraw. Then something unexpected happened. The tank lurched violently to one side, its right track visibly slipping in the mud. Instead of completing its turn, it slid several meters sideways before coming to a stop, now oriented at an awkward angle. "They're stuck," Miller said, not bothering to hide the note of satisfaction in his voice. "Looks like they bogged down in that marshy area." Through the optics, Harmon could see the tank commander gesturing animatedly to someone inside. The engine roared as they attempted to extract themselves, but the powerful machine only dug itself deeper into the soft ground. After several failed attempts, the commander disappeared back into the turret, presumably to radio for assistance. Should make for an interesting recovery operation, Rodriguez commented dryly. Bet someone's getting demoted tonight. Harmon continued to watch the stranded tank with growing concern. Its position was now just over 400 meters from the border, in a low-lying area that appeared to be growing more waterlogged by the hour due to the recent rainfall. If the water rose significantly, the crew could potentially face a hazardous situation. 20 minutes passed with no visible recovery vehicles approaching. The T-62's engine started and stopped several times as the crew made repeated attempts to free themselves, each effort seeming to worsen their predicament. Judgment 3-3 to Judgment Actual, Harmon radioed again. Target vehicle appears to be immobilized approximately 400 meters east of border. No recovery assets observed yet. Crew continuing extraction attempts without success. Copy 3-3, continue monitoring. Do not cross border under any circumstances. Recovery is their problem. Understood, Harmon replied, though a sense of unease was growing within him. Another hour passed. The T-62 remained stuck, now with visible water beginning to pool around its lower hull. The rain had intensified again, and the marshy ground was clearly worsening. Still no recovery vehicles had arrived from the Soviet side. Then a new development caught Harmon's attention. Smoke wisps rose from the engine compartment of the stranded tank. They've got mechanical issues, Miller reported, his tone now less triumphant. Could be overheating from repeated extraction attempts. The smoke gradually increased, soon becoming an alarming black plume. The tank commander emerged again, this time with obvious urgency. He climbed down from the turret and began examining the engine deck. Even from this distance, his body language conveyed clear distress. That's not good, Rodriguez said quietly. Engine fire in a tank is no joke. Fuel and ammunition make for a bad combination. Harmon made a quick decision. Judgment 3-3 to Judgment Actual. Target vehicle now showing signs of possible engine fire. Crew appears to be in potential distress. No recovery assets visible from their side. Request permission to approach border for better observation. The radio remained silent for several long seconds. Finally, 3-3, permission granted to approach to border fence for observation only. Do not cross under any circumstances. Battalion sending liaison to East German Border Command to alert them to the situation. Copy all, Harmon responded. Johnson, start engine, advance to border fence line, minimum profile approach. The M60's engine rumbled to life, and Johnson guided it forward with expert precision, using the terrain to maintain maximum concealment until the last possible moment. They halted precisely at the border clearing, still under tree cover, but with a clear line of sight to the troubled Soviet tank. The situation had deteriorated rapidly. Flames were now visible around the T-62's engine compartment, and the crew had fully evacuated the vehicle. They stood in ankle-deep water, frantically trying to combat the fire with handheld extinguishers that proved woefully inadequate for the task. Harmon counted 4 crew members, all present and seemingly uninjured, but their predicament was worsening by the minute. If the fire reached the ammunition stowage, the resulting explosion would be catastrophic. Through his binoculars, Harmon could now clearly see the face of the Soviet tank commander, a man perhaps in his early 30s with a determined expression that couldn't fully mask his concern. Their eyes seemed to meet across the distance, a moment of silent recognition between two professionals who understood exactly what was at stake. The Soviet officer made a decision. He ordered his crew to move further away from the vehicle while he made one last attempt to access the manual fire suppression system. It was a brave but potentially suicidal move if the ammunition cooked off while he was still on the tank. Judgment 3. 3 to Judgment Actual. Situation critical. Target vehicle fully engaged in engine fire. Crew evacuated but commander attempting suppression measures. High risk of ammunition detonation. Still no Soviet recovery assets visible. Request guidance. This time the response was immediate but unhelpful. 3-3. Maintain position. Do not cross border. Soviet forces have been notified through diplomatic channels. This is not our situation to resolve. Acknowledge. Harmon watched as the Soviet commander struggled with the external fire suppression controls that appeared to be malfunctioning. The flames were spreading toward the turret. Time was running out. Sir, Miller said quietly, that tank's going to blow with all its ammo. They're too close to survive the explosion. Harmon knew he was right. The Soviet crew had retreated somewhat, but remained within the kill radius of what would be a major detonation if the fire reached the main gun rounds. And their commander was still on the tank, fighting a losing battle against the flames. Military discipline warred with human decency in Harmon's mind. They weren't at war. These weren't enemies in the traditional sense. Just men doing their jobs on the opposite side of an ideological divide. Men who would die needlessly if someone didn't act. Judgment 3-3 acknowledges, Harmon finally responded. Then he made a decision that would alter the course of his life. Johnson advanced to border crossing point, full speed. Sir? Johnson questioned, surprised by the order. You heard me, Speedy. Move now. Harmon's voice left no room for debate. The M60 surged forward, breaking from cover and racing toward the nearest border checkpoint 300 meters away. Harmon grabbed the radio again. Judgment 3. 3 to all units, and proceeding to border checkpoint to coordinate possible emergency response with East German guards. Will not cross border without authorization. It wasn't entirely a lie. He did intend to speak with the border guards, but he had already decided that if diplomatic channels moved too slowly, he would cross regardless of authorization. They reached the checkpoint in under a minute. 2 startled East German border guards raised their weapons, then lowered them slightly when they recognized an American tank rather than an invasion force. Harmon emerged from his hatch, hands visible. Emergency situation, he called out in the basic German he had learned during deployment. Soviet tank burning. Explosion imminent. Need immediate assistance. The senior guard appeared conflicted, looking back and forth between Harmon and the distant burning tank. The guard said something into his radio, then approached the border fence. We see problem, he said in heavily accented English. Our commanders are aware. Soviet recovery team is coming. They'll be too late, Harmon insisted, pointing to the tank where flames had now engulfed the engine compartment completely. That tank will explode in minutes. The crew needs immediate help. The guard shook his head regretfully. Cannot authorize crossing. Must wait for proper channels. Proper channels. Men would die waiting for proper channels to evaluate the political implications of saving them. Harmon made his decision. Rodriguez, bring the med kit and fire extinguishers. Miller, man the radio. Johnson, you're with me. Harmon jumped down from the tank and approached the fence. We're coming through to provide emergency assistance. This is a humanitarian action, not a military operation. 9, the guard protested, raising his weapon again. Is forbidden. Then shoot me, Harmon replied calmly, reaching for the fence. But those men will die if someone doesn't help them now. Something in Harmon's unwavering gaze made the guard hesitate. In that moment of indecision, Harmon found the gate latch and yanked it open. He and Johnson rushed through, medical kit and fire extinguishers in hand, sprinting toward the burning tank. Behind them, Miller's voice crackled over the tank's external speakers. Judgment 3-3 to Judgment Actual. Lieutenant Harmon has crossed border under emergency humanitarian provisions to assist endangered Soviet crew. Request immediate diplomatic notification. This is not, repeat, not a hostile action. Harmon didn't hear the response as he and Johnson raced across the marshy ground toward the Soviet tank. The T-62's crew watched their approach with expressions ranging from shock to relief to suspicion. Their commander had climbed down from the burning vehicle, his uniform singed and face blackened with smoke, but he stood protectively in front of his men as the Americans approached. English? Harmon called out as they neared. Do you speak English? The Soviet officer nodded curtly. Some. Why are you here, American? Your tank is about to explode. You need to move your men further back immediately. Harmon pointed to the burning vehicle, where the fire had now reached the turret ring, a dangerously close proximity to the ammunition storage. The Soviet commander assessed Harmon for a brief moment, then turned to his crew and issued rapid commands in Russian. They retreated further, though the commander himself remained. I am Lieutenant Viktor Sokolov, he said, his accent thick but words clear. You have crossed border. This is serious violation. Lieutenant James Harmon, and yes, I'm aware. Harmon handed Johnson his fire extinguisher and medical kit. Speedy, help their crew. Check for injuries. To Sokolov, he continued, how long until your recovery team arrives? Sokolov's expression tightened. Radio damaged in fire. Could not call for help. You are first response. That explained the lack of Soviet recovery vehicles. Harmon glanced at the burning tank, now clearly beyond saving. We need to move further back. That ammunition will cook off any minute. As if summoned by his words, a sharp cracking sound emanated from the T-62, followed by a minor explosion as a stored round detonated from the heat. It wasn't the main detonation, but it signaled the beginning of the end. Now, Harmon shouted, grabbing Sokolov's arm and pulling him into a run. They had barely made it 20 meters when the world seemed to explode behind them. The force of the blast knocked both men forward into the mud. Harmon felt a searing pain across his right temple as shrapnel grazed him. He rolled onto his back, ears ringing, to see a massive fireball rising from what remained of the T-62. Smaller secondary explosions continued as additional ammunition detonated. Beside him, Sokolov struggled to his feet, face contorted in anguish as he watched his tank disintegrate in flames. Blood trickled from a cut on his cheek, but he seemed otherwise unharmed. "Your men?" Harmon asked as he stood shakily. "Safe," Sokolov replied, pointing to where Johnson had managed to get the Soviet crew to a depression in the ground that provided some protection from the blast. "Thanks to you." The moment of shared humanity was brief. Already, vehicles were approaching from both sides of the border, military police from the west, what appeared to be KGB from the east. The diplomatic incident Harmon had created was about to become very official. "Your career," Sokolov said quietly, understanding in his eyes. "This will cost you." Harmon shrugged, wincing at the pain from what would become the scar above his eyebrow. "Some things matter more than careers, Lieutenant." Sokolov studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. Some things matter more." Harmon clasped the offered hand. Two warriors briefly united across the artificial boundaries that separated them. It would be the first of many unexpected connections between them, though neither could have imagined how their lives would remain intertwined through the decades to come. As the military police approached, Harmon saw Major Adams among them, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. The consequences would indeed be severe, perhaps career-ending. But watching Johnson helping one of the Soviet crewmen with a bandage, seeing the gratitude in the eyes of men who minutes ago had been the faceless enemy, Harmon knew he would make the same choice again. Some lines were worth crossing, even in the Cold War. Sometimes the human obligation transcended political boundaries and military orders. It was a lesson neither he nor Sokolov would ever forget, a foundation for an unlikely bond that would endure through the collapse of empires and the transformation of the world they had been trained to fight over. The rain began falling harder, washing the mud and blood from both American and Soviet uniforms, rendering them momentarily indistinguishable in the gray afternoon light of a divided Germany. The military police escorted Lieutenant Harmon back across the border with clinical efficiency. Their expressions betrayed nothing, but the rigid set of their shoulders spoke volumes. No one made eye contact. No one spoke beyond necessary commands. The unspoken message was clear. He had committed the ultimate military sin. He had broken the chain of command. Major Adams waited beside a command Humvee, rain pelting his cover as he stood ramrod straight, face carved from granite. Behind him, Captain Richards looked considerably more concerned, his eyes darting between Harmon and the burning remains of the Soviet T-62 across the border. "Lieutenant Harmon," Adams said, his voice preternaturally calm, "you will surrender your sidearm to Captain Richards and consider yourself under arrest pending investigation for violation of direct orders and unauthorized border crossing." Harmon complied without protest, unfastening his holster and handing it to Richards. The rain mingled with the blood from his temple wound, creating pink rivulets down his cheek. "Get in! Get in!" Adams ordered, gesturing to the Humvee. "Your crew will return the tank to base under Richards' command." The ride back to base passed in silence. Harmon watched the countryside through rain-streaked windows, mentally preparing for the consequences of his actions. He had known exactly what he was risking when he crossed that border. Careers had ended for far less. At headquarters, he was escorted to an empty conference room and left alone for 2 hours, a psychological tactic as old as interrogation itself. When the door finally opened, it wasn't Adams who entered, but Colonel Bennett, the battalion commander. Behind him came an unfamiliar officer bearing the insignia of Army intelligence. "Lieutenant," Bennett said, his voice betraying neither anger nor sympathy, "this is Major Wilson from INSCOM. He has some questions about today's incident." Bennett took a seat at the far end of the table while Wilson placed a tape recorder in the center and sat directly opposite Harmon. "Let's start from the beginning, Lieutenant," Wilson said, his accent placing him somewhere in the American Northeast. "Walk me through your decision-making process from the moment you spotted the Soviet tank in distress." Harmon recounted the events precisely as they had occurred, from the initial observation to the final explosion. He offered no justifications or excuses for his border crossing, simply stating that he had deemed the risk to human life sufficient to warrant emergency action. And during your interaction with the Soviet crew, Wilson continued, did Lieutenant Sokolov say anything regarding the modified T-62 or its DROSD system? So that was their primary concern. Not the border violation itself, but what intelligence might have been gained during the encounter. Harmon should have expected as much. No, sir. There was no discussion of equipment or technology. The situation was time-critical and focused entirely on the immediate danger. Wilson's expression revealed nothing as he made notes. And you're certain the tank that was destroyed was the DROSD-equipped variant your platoon has been observing? Yes, sir. We had confirmed the identification through optical equipment prior to the incident. The distinctive radar panels and countermeasure launchers were clearly visible. A glint of satisfaction showed briefly in Wilson's eyes. The destruction of the prototype tank represented a significant intelligence coup, regardless of how it had occurred. The Soviets had lost a valuable testing platform, and the West had gained confirmation of their technological direction without revealing their own hand. I understand Lieutenant Sokolov's crew was unable to radio for assistance due to equipment damage, Wilson continued. Did they mention any other communication attempts or protocols? No, sir. The lieutenant indicated only that their radio was damaged in the fire. Wilson exchanged a significant glance with Colonel Bennett before continuing. Lieutenant Harmon, I'm going to be direct with you. Your border crossing has created a diplomatic situation that's being handled at levels far above this room. However, the incident has also provided an unexpected opportunity. Harmon remained silent, waiting for the other shoe to drop. You established a personal connection with a Soviet officer under unusual circumstances. That connection might be valuable in ways I'm not at liberty to fully disclose. Wilson leaned forward slightly. If you were given the opportunity to speak with Lieutenant Sokolov again, in a controlled environment, would you be willing to do so? The question caught Harmon off guard. He had expected court-martial proceedings, not recruitment into what sounded suspiciously like an intelligence operation. I would need to understand the purpose and parameters of such a meeting, sir, he answered cautiously. Wilson nodded as if Harmon's response had confirmed something. Your caution is appropriate. Here's what I can tell you. We have reason to believe there's unusual activity within the Soviet armor divisions stationed along the border. Activity that doesn't align with their standard protocols or chain of command. Lieutenant Sokolov may have information relevant to our concerns, whether he realizes it or not. And you believe he might share this information with me because I helped save his crew? Harmon's skepticism was evident. Human nature is a powerful factor, Lieutenant. Men who face death together often form bonds that transcend their formal allegiances. Wilson shut off the tape recorder. Off the record now. Your career is at a crossroads. The border violation could end your military future, or it could be reclassified as part of a sanctioned intelligence gathering operation. The choice is largely yours. The implicit deal was clear. Cooperate with whatever Inscom was planning, or face the consequences of his actions without their protection. Harmon had no illusions about the self-serving nature of their offer, but he also couldn't deny his curiosity about what was happening on the Soviet side. When would this meeting take place, he asked. Tomorrow. East German authorities have agreed to a formal debriefing regarding the incident at a neutral location in Berlin. Lieutenant Sokolov will be present as the Soviet representative. You would attend as our technical expert on the tank recovery operation, accompanied by appropriate security personnel. So soon. That meant this had been planned even before his questioning began. Harmon studied Wilson's impassive face, trying to discern the full scope of what he was being drawn into. I'll do it, he said finally, but I won't deliberately mislead him. If this is about building trust, it has to be genuine. Wilson's lips thinned slightly. Admirable principles, Lieutenant. Just remember that Sokolov serves a system that doesn't share them. We'll brief you on specific topics of interest tomorrow morning. Until then, you're confined to quarters. He stood, signaling the end of the discussion. Consider yourself fortunate, Harmon. Not many lieutenants get a second chance after the stunt you pulled today. After they left, Harmon remained seated in the conference room, turning over Wilson's words in his mind. The opportunity felt suspiciously like exploitation of both himself and Sokolov. Yet he couldn't deny the importance of understanding what was happening with the DROSD system and Soviet armor tactics. If talking to Sokolov could provide insights that might prevent future conflicts or save American lives, wasn't that worth the moral ambiguity? Hours later, back in his quarters under guard, Harmon was surprised by a visit from Rodriguez. The loader looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot as he stood just inside the door. "They're saying you're going to be court-martialed, sir," Rodriguez said without preamble. "That remains to be seen," Harmon replied carefully, aware that his room might be monitored now. "The crew wanted you to know we'd testify on your behalf. What you did out there—" Rodriguez paused, searching for words. "It was the right call, sir. Those men would be dead otherwise." Harmon felt a swell of gratitude for his crew's loyalty. "I appreciate that, Doc, but this is my responsibility, not yours. You all followed orders. That's what matters." Rodriguez nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "There's something else, sir. Miller noticed something about that Soviet tank before it caught fire. He said the external fuel tanks had been removed, but there were fresh attachment points for something else. Something that wasn't there during yesterday's observation." Harmon's interest sharpened immediately. The T-62 typically carried external fuel drums on the rear hull. Their removal wasn't standard procedure for normal exercises. Did he get a clear enough look to identify what might have been attached instead? "Negative, sir, but he said it looked like some kind of mounting bracket, similar to what we use for external equipment housing." Rodriguez glanced toward the door, lowering his voice. "The intelligence officers didn't ask about any of this. They seemed more interested in whether Sokolov said anything to you." That was concerning. Either Army intelligence already knew about the modifications and didn't want to reveal their knowledge, or they were focused so narrowly on the Drozd system that they were missing potentially important details. "Tell Miller good observation. Keep this between the crew for now." Harmon moved closer, keeping his voice just above a whisper. "I'm meeting with Sokolov tomorrow as part of a debriefing. If you notice anything else unusual about Soviet armor movements, make note of it, but report through standard channels." Rodriguez seemed to understand the subtext. "You think something bigger is going on, sir?" "I think we're seeing pieces of a puzzle without knowing what the full picture looks like," Harmon replied carefully. "Just keep your eyes open." After Rodriguez left, Harmon lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, mind racing. The modified fuel tank mounting points, the Drozd system, the unusual exercise patterns close to the border all pointed to something significant in development. But Wilson's interest had been strangely specific, almost as if he already knew what to look for and was merely seeking confirmation. Sleep came fitfully, his dreams filled with burning tanks and invisible boundaries being crossed, again and again. The morning brought a cold, efficient briefing from Wilson and two other intelligence officers. They outlined specific areas of interest regarding Soviet armor capabilities, command structures, and deployment patterns, emphasizing casual conversation rather than direct questioning. "Remember, this isn't an interrogation," Wilson instructed. "It's information gathering through relationship building. Find common ground. Establish yourself as someone Sokolov might want to talk with again in the future." The subtext was clear. They wanted Harmon to develop Sokolov as an intelligence asset, whether through friendship or manipulation. The thought left a sour taste in his mouth. Berlin's Tempelhof Airport served as the neutral meeting ground, its international status making it suitable for sensitive cross-border discussions. Harmon was escorted to a nondescript conference room in the administrative section, where East German officials and their Soviet counterparts were already waiting. Viktor Sokolov stood by the window, gazing out at the tarmac with his hands clasped behind his back. He had changed into a fresh uniform, but a butterfly bandage on his cheek marked where debris from the explosion had struck him. He turned as Harmon entered, his expression carefully neutral until their eyes met. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded in recognition. The formalities proceeded with glacial, diplomatic precision. Statements were read, translated, and recorded regarding the unfortunate incident at the border. No mention was made of Harmon's unauthorized crossing or the classified nature of the destroyed tank. Everything was sanitized for the official record, reduced to a regrettable mechanical failure, and subsequent humanitarian response. When the formal debriefing concluded, Wilson orchestrated a seemingly casual moment where Harmon and Sokolov found themselves alone by the coffee service, while the senior officials conferred at the other end of the room. "Your head," Sokolov said quietly, gesturing to the stitched wound above Harmon's eyebrow. "It will scar." "Small price," Harmon replied, pouring coffee into 2 cups and offering one to the Soviet officer. "How's your crew?" "Alive, thanks to you." Sokolov accepted the coffee with a slight nod. "Though our careers may suffer similar fates for this incident." Harmon smiled faintly. "The hazards of command decisions." A moment of understanding passed between them, transcending the artificial boundaries of nation and ideology. They were both soldiers caught in the gears of larger machinery. "I must ask," Sokolov said, his voice dropping further. "Why did you cross? You risked everything for men you are trained to consider enemies." It was the opening Wilson had prepared him for, but Harmon found himself answering with unscripted honesty. "Because in that moment you weren't enemies. You were soldiers in danger." The politics seemed irrelevant. Sokolov studied him intently, as if trying to detect deception. Finding none, he seemed to come to a decision. "The tank," he said carefully. "It was special prototype. There will be questions about its loss, difficult questions." Harmon maintained a neutral expression, though his pulse quickened. "Mechanical failures happen to everyone, especially with experimental equipment." "Duh, but some will suggest it was not accident, that perhaps Western interference caused failure." Sokolov sipped his coffee, eyes never leaving Harmon's. "Such accusations would be convenient for certain parties within our command." "What do you mean?" Harmon asked, genuine curiosity overriding his brief caution. Sokolov glanced toward the officials, ensuring they remained engaged elsewhere. "There are those who desire escalation, who believe conflict is inevitable and therefore should come on terms of their choosing." The statement sent a chill through Harmon. He had heard similar sentiments from hardliners on his own side, officers who viewed detente as merely postponing the inevitable confrontation with the Soviet Union. And the Drozd system? Is that part of their preparation? The question slipped out before he could consider its implications. Sokolov's expression flickered with surprise before settling back into careful neutrality. "You are well informed, Lieutenant. Yes, Drozd is one component. There are others, components that some would use before they are fully tested, regardless of risk." It was as close to a warning as could be expected from a Soviet officer speaking to an American counterpart. Harmon wanted to press further, to ask about the modified mounting points Rodriguez had mentioned, but he knew pushing too hard would only raise Sokolov's suspicions. Instead, he opted for building the connection Wilson had emphasized. "Chess?" he asked, noting a small travel set among Sokolov's personal items on a nearby chair. The Soviet officer's expression softened slightly. "You play?" "Not well enough, probably, but I enjoy the challenge." Sokolov retrieved the set and began setting up the pieces on a small side table. The move drew glances from the officials, but no one intervened. A simple game between military officers made for good optics in the carefully choreographed diplomatic dance. As they played, their conversation drifted to safer topics: military training, technical aspects of their respective tanks, the challenges of command. Yet beneath the surface pleasantries, Harmon sensed Sokolov was evaluating him, just as he was evaluating Sokolov. "Your style is aggressive, but not reckless," the Soviet officer commented after Harmon's particularly bold move with his knight. "You take calculated risks." "Sometimes the board requires it," Harmon replied, watching as Sokolov countered with a subtle defensive repositioning. "And yours is methodical, patient. In chess, as in war, patience often decides the outcome." Sokolov studied the board. "Though I suspect neither of us will see victory today." He was right. Their skill levels were too evenly matched for the abbreviated game their supervisors would allow. But the symbolic stalemate seemed appropriate, an acknowledgement of the larger impasse their nations found themselves in. As they reset the pieces, Sokolov spoke so quietly that Harmon had to lean forward to hear him. "The next exercises begin Tuesday. Valley Sector D7. If you are observing, maintain greater distance than yesterday. Some technologies being tested do not discriminate between friend and foe." Before Harmon could respond, Wilson approached, signaling that their time was up. The warning, if that's what it was, hung in the air between them as they exchanged formal handshakes for the benefit of their respective handlers. "Perhaps we will meet again under better circumstances, Lieutenant Harmon," Sokolov said, loud enough for others to hear. "I'd welcome that, Lieutenant Sokolov," Harmon replied with equal formality. As Harmon was escorted back to the American sector, his mind raced with the implications of their conversation. Sokolov had effectively warned him about upcoming weapons tests while simultaneously establishing plausible deniability. The question was why. Was it genuine concern for potential escalation, a calculated move to mislead American intelligence, or something more personal? Wilson didn't wait long to debrief him, pulling Harmon into a secure room at the American Military Liaison Office before they even left the airport complex. "Well," the intelligence officer demanded once the door was closed. "What did you get?" Harmon reported most of the conversation verbatim, including Sokolov's warning about Tuesday's exercises. He omitted only the Soviets' suggestion that some within their command desired escalation. The implication was too serious to share without further evidence. Wilson seemed pleased with the intelligence on the upcoming tests, but pressed for more. Did he mention specific capabilities, deployment strategies, names of senior officers involved with the program? No, Harmon replied. Our conversation remained general. Pushing for those details would have been too obvious. Wilson grudgingly accepted this assessment. Nevertheless, you've established initial rapport. That's valuable. We'll arrange for your platoon to observe Tuesday's exercises, but from maximum safe distance given his warning. If Sokolov is testing new weapon systems beyond Drozd, we need to know exactly what capabilities we're facing. Back at base that evening, Harmon found himself in a strange limbo. The official investigation into his border crossing had been quietly shelved, replaced by his new unofficial role in intelligence gathering. His crew welcomed him back with obvious relief, though no one asked details about his meeting in Berlin. They understood operational security, even when the operation remained undefined. Later, alone in his quarters, Harmon recorded his observations in his personal notebook, focusing on details of Sokolov's demeanor in subtle cues rather than his explicit statements. Something about the Soviet officer's warning continued to trouble him. It hadn't felt like deception or misdirection, but genuine concern that events were moving beyond either of their control. The weekend passed in a flurry of preparation for Tuesday's observation mission. Wilson brought in specialized long-range surveillance equipment and arranged for signals intelligence support to monitor Soviet radio traffic during the exercises. Harmon's platoon would be deployed to multiple observation points to ensure maximum coverage of the exercise area, with Steel Justice assigned the primary observation post at the furthest distance from the border in accordance with Sokolov's warning. On Monday night, Captain Richards called Harmon to his office for a final review of the operation plan. The maps spread across his desk showed their observation positions marked in blue, with projected Soviet exercise areas highlighted in red. SIGINT reports increased activity in the staging areas, Richards noted, tapping one section of the map. More units than we typically see for a standard exercise. Battalion strength at minimum. Harmon studied the deployments with growing concern. That's a lot of firepower for a weapons test. Are we sure this is just an exercise? Richards frowned. That's what all indicators suggest, but I've requested additional air reconnaissance to be safe. If anything changes, we'll know in real time. As Harmon turned to leave, Richards added, "One more thing, Lieutenant. Major Adams is concerned about your objectivity regarding the Soviet tank commander. He feels you may be overly sympathetic." The statement was carefully neutral, but the implication was clear. Harmon's actions at the border had raised questions about his judgment. "My concern was for human life, sir, not politics," Harmon replied evenly. "That doesn't affect my commitment to our mission or my ability to assess threats accurately." Richards held his gaze for a long moment. "See that it doesn't. We're all watching a very delicate situation here. One mistake could have consequences none of us want to contemplate." The warning stayed with Harmon as he prepared for bed, checking and rechecking his equipment for the pre-dawn departure. Whatever was happening across the border, whatever Sokolov had tried to warn him about, tomorrow would bring them one step closer to understanding the full picture. But as he drifted towards sleep, Harmon couldn't shake the feeling that they were all pawns in a much larger game. One where the rules remained hidden and the true players operated from positions far removed from the front lines, where the consequences of their decisions would be felt most keenly. Chapter 5, The Hunt for Truth. Tuesday morning arrived shrouded in fog, limiting visibility to less than 300 meters in some areas. Harmon's platoon departed base at 0500 hours, moving in staggered formation toward their designated observation positions. The weather provided excellent concealment, but would significantly hamper their primary mission of visual intelligence gathering. "Visibility's for shit," Miller grumbled as he adjusted his optical equipment for the 10th time. "If they're testing anything today, we'll be lucky to see it at all." "Maybe that's the point," Harmon replied thoughtfully. "Perfect conditions for testing systems designed to operate in reduced visibility." Steel Justice had taken position on a wooded ridge overlooking the valley where Sokolov had indicated the exercises would occur. They were nearly 3 kilometers from the border, well beyond normal observation range, but well within the safety margin implied by the Soviet officer's warning. By 0700, the other tanks in Harmon's platoon had reported reaching their positions. The SIGINT team established in a concealed position nearby confirmed increased radio traffic on Soviet frequencies, though most was encrypted and undecipherable. Contact, Miller reported suddenly. Multiple heat signatures entering the valley from the northeast. Armor moving in formation. Harmon swiveled his commander's sight to the indicated sector. Through the thermal imaging, he could make out the distinctive shapes of tanks moving through the fog, their engines generating bright thermal blooms against the cooler background. Count 7, no 9 T-62s, Miller continued. Standard spacing, tactical formation. Looks like a combat exercise scenario, not just equipment testing. Harmon noted the formation details, which indeed suggested preparation for engagement rather than controlled testing conditions. Any sign of modified variants? Not yet. All appear to be standard configuration from this distance. For the next hour, they observed as the Soviet tanks maneuvered through the valley, occasionally firing practice rounds that generated distinctive thermal flares in their imaging systems. Nothing about the exercise seemed unusual or particularly threatening, despite Sokolov's warning. Then, at approximately 0830, the pattern changed. The T-62s formed a defensive perimeter and ceased movement as if waiting for something. 20 minutes later, a new vehicle signature appeared on their thermal imaging. New contact, Miller reported, tension evident in his voice. Larger than the T-62s, moving slowly from the eastern approach. Harmon adjusted his optics to maximum magnification. Through the fog and thermal distortion, he could make out a massive silhouette that dwarfed the T-62s. The vehicle's heat signature was unlike anything he'd seen before, with multiple hot spots indicating a more complex power system than standard Soviet tanks. "That's not a T-62, he said quietly. "Dimensions are all wrong. That's something new." The massive vehicle continued its advance until it reached the center of the T-62 perimeter. Even at this distance and through the fog, Harmon could tell it was substantially larger than standard Soviet main battle tanks, significantly heavier, and with a distinctively elongated hull. "Sir," Rodriguez said from behind him, "SIGINT is picking up increased chatter. They're saying Soviet command frequencies just went to heightened alert status. This isn't a scheduled exercise." Harmon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning fog. Sokolov's warning about technologies that do not discriminate between friend and foe took on new urgency. Was this massive vehicle the weapons platform he had been warning about? "Contact judgment actual," Harmon ordered. "Report our observations and request guidance. Emphasize the unusual nature of the vehicle and the command alert status." As Rodriguez relayed the message, Miller continued his observation. "Sir, the new vehicle has stopped. The T-62s are withdrawing to a wider perimeter. It looks like they're preparing for some kind of demonstration or weapons test." Before Harmon could respond, a blinding flash erupted from the massive vehicle, visible even through the fog as a sudden thermal bloom that overwhelmed their imaging systems momentarily. When the sensors recovered seconds later, 2 of the T-62s on the perimeter were showing extreme heat signatures consistent with catastrophic damage. "What the hell was that?" Miller exclaimed. There was no projectile trajectory, no conventional weapon signature at all. Harmon studied the aftermath with growing alarm. The damaged T-62s appeared to have suffered some kind of internal systems failure rather than external impact damage. Their engines were overheating dramatically, and one showed signs of ammunition cooking off inside the turret. Some kind of directed energy weapon, he theorized, recalling classified briefings on experimental Soviet programs. Or electromagnetic pulse technology, something that disrupts electrical systems or detonates ammunition remotely. The radio crackled with an urgent transmission from command. "All judgment units, withdraw immediately to fallback positions. Repeat, withdraw to fallback positions. Soviet forces have initiated Condition Amber along the entire border sector." Condition Amber indicated heightened military readiness just short of actual combat alert. Something about the weapons test had triggered a broader Soviet response beyond the immediate exercise area. "Start engine," Harmon ordered. "We're pulling back. Miller, maintain observation as long as possible. I want every detail you can get on that vehicle." As Johnson brought the tank's engine to life, Harmon continued to study the scene in the valley. The undamaged T-62s were now forming a protective cordon around the mysterious vehicle as it began to withdraw eastward. There would be no further demonstrations today. "Sir," Rodriguez said urgently, "SIGINT reports Soviet air defense batteries activating across the border. Multiple radar systems coming online." The implications were disturbing. Either the Soviets were concerned about potential Western observation of their new weapon, or they were preparing for a more significant escalation. Either way, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Harmon's platoon withdrew to their designated fallback positions without incident, but the tension remained palpable. By mid-afternoon, the entire American sector was at heightened alert status, with additional air defense units deployed and leave canceled for all personnel. Major Wilson summoned Harmon to a secure briefing room at headquarters, where satellite imagery of the morning's exercise was already being analyzed. The photos, taken through breaks in the cloud cover, showed the mysterious vehicle more clearly than their ground observation had permitted. Object Avalanche, Wilson said, indicating the vehicle in the imagery. That's our designation for it. The Soviets call it something else, but its existence has been theoretical until now. Today was its first confirmed field deployment. What is it? Harmon asked, studying the strange proportions of the vehicle. A directed energy weapons platform, specifically designed to disable electronic systems and detonate ammunition through armor without conventional penetration. Wilson's expression was grim. If deployed in significant numbers, it could neutralize NATO armor advantages across the European theater. But it wouldn't be selective, Harmon noted, remembering Sokolov's warning. In a fluid battlefield situation, it could affect friendly forces as well. Precisely why its development has been controversial even within the Soviet military. Wilson pulled out another file stamped with highest classification markings. Lieutenant, what I'm about to share is known to fewer than 20 people outside the Joint Chiefs. We need your assessment of whether Lieutenant Sokolov might be aware of this information, and if so, whether he might be willing to provide further details. The file contained intercepted communications suggesting a faction within the Soviet High Command was pushing for accelerated deployment of the Avalanche platform despite technical reservations from the engineering teams. More disturbingly, there were indications that some hardliners viewed it as a potential first strike weapon that could paralyze NATO forces in the critical early hours of a conflict. The field test you observed wasn't sanctioned through normal channels, Wilson continued. It appears to have been orchestrated by General Kuznetsov, a known hardliner with close ties to elements in the KGB who opposed détente. The regular border units, including Sokolov's command, weren't fully briefed on the demonstration parameters. Harmon considered this information alongside Sokolov's warning. He knew something was happening, but maybe not the full scope. His concerns seemed genuine. That's our assessment as well. Wilson closed the file, which brings us to your next meeting with him. Next meeting? Harmon questioned. I wasn't aware that was scheduled. It wasn't until an hour ago. East German authorities have requested a follow-up meeting regarding yesterday's incident, specifically to address safety protocols for border-adjacent exercises. Lieutenant Sokolov has been designated as their technical representative. Wilson's expression made it clear this was no coincidence. The meeting is scheduled for tomorrow in Berlin, same location. Harmon understood the implication. Either Sokolov or someone above him had engineered this opportunity for another conversation. The question was why and with what agenda. What exactly do you want from me this time? He asked directly. Information on Avalanche, deployment schedules, technical specifications, command authorization protocols, anything Sokolov might know or be willing to share. But most importantly, confirmation of Kuznetsov's involvement and intentions. Wilson leaned forward. If the hardliners are making a play for accelerated deployment, we need to know now, not after they've established tactical superiority. The briefing continued with technical details of the Avalanche system based on today's observations and theoretical capabilities derived from intelligence sources. By the time Harmon returned to his quarters that evening, his mind was wrestling with the implications. If Wilson's information was accurate, a dangerous faction within the Soviet military was pushing for deployment of a weapon that could dramatically escalate tensions and potentially trigger the very conflict it was supposedly designed to win. And Harmon was being asked to extract this information from Sokolov, potentially placing the Soviet officer in extreme danger if his cooperation was discovered. The ethical quandary kept him awake late into the night. His military duty was clear: gather intelligence that could protect American forces and interests. But the human connection he had formed with Sokolov complicated matters. Using their nascent trust to manipulate the Soviet officer into revealing sensitive information felt wrong, particularly when Sokolov had already taken a risk to warn him about the test. By morning, Harmon had reached a decision. He would meet with Sokolov as directed, but he would approach the conversation with honesty rather than manipulation. If the Soviet officer was genuinely concerned about the actions of hardliners within his own military, an open exchange of information might serve both their interests better than deception. The Berlin meeting was arranged with the same diplomatic choreography as before, though the personnel were reduced to just essential participants. Harmon noted that both Wilson and his Soviet counterpart were present, watching from opposite sides of the room with equally predatory attention. Sokolov appeared more strained than during their previous meeting, with new lines of tension around his eyes and mouth. He greeted Harmon with formal correctness, but there was a wariness in his gaze that hadn't been present before. When the opportunity for private conversation arose, again orchestrated to appear coincidental, Sokolov spoke first. "You observed yesterday's exercise," he said without preamble, "despite my warning." "From a safe distance," Harmon confirmed, "as you recommended." Sokolov's jaw tightened. There is no truly safe distance from avalanche when it is fully powered. Yesterday was a reduced demonstration. Had it been operating at full capacity, he left the implication hanging. Harmon felt a jolt of surprise at Sokolov's open reference to the system by name. Either the Soviet officer had decided to be more forthcoming, or he was testing Harmon's reaction to determine how much American intelligence already knew. "We've designated it Object Avalanche," Harmon acknowledged, deciding that honesty offered the best chance of productive dialogue. "Our analysts are concerned about its implications for regional stability." "As they should be," Sokolov replied grimly, "as are many within our own command who understand its true capabilities." He glanced toward his handler, who was engaged in conversation with an East German official. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "Kuznetsov is pushing for forward deployment next month. 3 systems initially, expanding to 12 by year's end, positioned to cover critical NATO approach corridors." He met Harmon's gaze directly. "The technical safeguards are incomplete. The targeting discrimination systems fail under certain conditions, affecting friendly forces within the effective radius. These concerns have been deliberately omitted from reports to the State Defense Committee." The specificity of the information was startling. Sokolov wasn't hinting or suggesting. He was providing actionable intelligence at great personal risk. "Why are you telling me this?" Harmon asked quietly. Sokolov's expression hardened. "Because I am a soldier, not a suicide zealot. Avalanche in its current form would trigger exactly the conflict Kuznetsov claims it would prevent. Once deployed, the temptation to use it before the West develops countermeasures would be too great for certain elements to resist." Harmon understood. Sokolov wasn't betraying his country. He was trying to prevent a catastrophic miscalculation by hardliners within his own military. It was the same concern that motivated reasonable officers on both sides of the Iron Curtain men, who understood that the Cold War remaining cold was in everyone's interest. "What happens if deployment proceeds as Kuznetsov plans?" Harmon asked. "Best case, extreme diplomatic pressure when your intelligence confirms the deployments, leading to heightened tensions and potential limited engagements as both sides test boundaries." Sokolov's voice grew even quieter. "Worst case, someone decides the window of tactical advantage is too valuable to waste, and we find ourselves in a conflict that quickly escalates beyond control." The Soviet officer withdrew a cigarette case from his pocket, offering one to Harmon, who declined. As Sokolov lit his own cigarette, he continued in measured tones that would appear as casual conversation to observers. "There are those of us who believe this technology should be subject to the same verification and limitation protocols as strategic weapons. Its capacity to upset the balance of power is too significant for unilateral deployment." It was as close to a policy statement as a Soviet lieutenant could safely make, and its implications were profound. Sokolov was suggesting that officers within the Soviet military would support arms control measures specifically targeting the avalanche system, an extraordinary breach of the monolithic front usually presented to the West. "I believe many on our side would share that perspective," Harmon replied carefully, "if the right channels of communication existed." Sokolov took a long drag from his cigarette, exhaling slowly. "Perhaps they do now." The moment was interrupted by the approach of Wilson, who had apparently decided their conversation had continued long enough. "Lieutenant Harmon, we need to prepare for the formal session," he said pointedly. Sokolov nodded to both men and moved away, resuming his position near the Soviet delegation. The brief exchange had lasted less than 5 minutes, but its content could potentially alter the strategic calculations of both superpowers. During the debriefing with Wilson afterward, Harmon reported Sokolov's information about Kuznetsov's deployment plans and the technical concerns regarding target discrimination. He emphasized the Soviet officer's apparent belief that premature deployment could destabilize the strategic balance. "Do you assess this information as reliable?" Wilson asked, his expression betraying nothing. "Yes," Harmon replied without hesitation. Sokolov had no reason to fabricate these specific details, and considerable personal risk in sharing them. Wilson nodded slowly. "That aligns with other intelligence we've received. The question is whether Sokolov is operating on his own initiative or as part of a sanctioned back channel from elements within the Soviet military who oppose Kuznetsov's faction." "Does it matter?" Harmon asked. "The information is valuable either way." "It matters because it determines how we proceed." Wilson closed his notebook. If Sokolov is a lone actor, he's vulnerable and potentially expendable from both sides' perspective. If he represents a faction with some level of authority, he becomes a potential conduit for unofficial negotiations regarding avalanche limitations. The clinical assessment of Sokolov's value and vulnerability disturbed Harmon, though he recognized its pragmatic logic. Intelligence work inevitably reduced human beings to assets or obstacles. Their worth measured in the information they could provide or the influence they could exert. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we validate his information against other sources, assess its credibility, and determine appropriate responses at levels far above your pay grade, Lieutenant." Wilson's tone softened slightly. "For what it's worth, I believe you've established a potentially valuable connection. One we may need to activate again depending on how events unfold." Back at base, Harmon found his platoon preparing for an extended deployment to forward observation posts. The entire NATO command structure had shifted to heightened readiness following the previous day's demonstration of the avalanche system, with particular emphasis on electronic warfare countermeasures. Rodriguez approached as Harmon was reviewing the deployment orders, his expression troubled. "Sir, there's something you should know," he said in a low voice. "Miller's brother works in SIGINT at division level. He says they've been picking up unusual communications patterns for the past week, fragments suggesting some kind of operation or event scheduled for next Tuesday. Nothing concrete, just references to the demonstration and conclusive proof of concept." Tuesday, the day Sokolov had mentioned potential deployment preparations would begin. The correlation was too strong to be coincidental. "Has this been reported through official channels?" Harmon asked. "That's just it, sir. Miller says his brother was told to focus on conventional military communications only. These fragments were flagged but apparently deemed low priority." Rodriguez hesitated. "It feels like different parts of our intelligence apparatus aren't sharing information effectively, or deliberately compartmentalizing it," Harmon thought. Wilson had mentioned that knowledge of avalanche was restricted to a very limited group. If some intelligence officers were purposely downplaying certain signals to maintain control over the information flow, tell Miller to have his brother keep monitoring those frequencies, but discreetly. No official requests, nothing that would draw attention. I need to know immediately if any more references to Tuesday appear." Rodriguez nodded, understanding the delicacy of the situation. "You think something big is coming, don't you, sir?" Harmon considered his response carefully. "I think we're seeing pieces of a puzzle that some people might prefer remains unsolved until they're ready to reveal it." The loader's expression grew more serious. "We've got your back, Lieutenant. Whatever's coming, the crew stands with you." The simple statement of loyalty touched Harmon deeply. His crew had followed him across a forbidden border without hesitation, trusting his judgment even when it contradicted direct orders. That trust was a responsibility he carried with increasing weight as the situation grew more complex and dangerous. Over the next 4 days, Harmon's platoon conducted routine border observation missions, reporting normal Soviet activity patterns with no further sign of the avalanche vehicle. On the surface, the situation appeared to be normalizing, but beneath the calm, tensions continued to build. Additional intelligence fragments filtered through unofficial channels, consistent with Sokolov's warning about preparations for forward deployment. Satellite imagery showed increased activity at several bases identified as potential staging areas for the new weapon system. Most concerning were intercepted logistics requests for specialized power generation equipment, the exact type that would be required to support Avalanche's energy demands in field conditions. On Sunday evening, Major Adams summoned Harmon to his office, where he found Wilson already waiting. The intelligence officer's typically composed demeanor showed subtle signs of strained lines around his mouth and a tightness in his shoulders that spoke of prolonged stress. Lieutenant, Adams began without preamble. We've received intelligence indicating a significant Soviet armor movement scheduled for Tuesday morning, centered on the Fulda Gap region. Initial assessments suggest it could be preparation for deploying the avalanche system in proximity to our forward positions. Wilson picked up the briefing. Multiple sources now confirm General Kuznetsov has secured provisional authorization for field testing in operational conditions, despite technical reservations from the development team. The deployment falls short of the full battle-ready status he advocated for, but represents a concerning escalation nonetheless. Harmon absorbed this information, connecting it with what Sokolov had shared and the fragments Rodriguez had reported. What's our response? NATO forces are being placed on elevated alert status effective 0600 tomorrow. Your platoon will deploy to Observation Point Echo 9 as part of a coordinated monitoring operation. Adams indicated the position on a wall map, noting its proximity to the projected Soviet movement corridor. You'll be tasked with real-time observation and reporting, but under no circumstances are you to engage unless directly threatened. Wilson added, we have reason to believe Lieutenant Sokolov's unit will be involved in the deployment security cordon. His tank was identified in staging area preparations yesterday. The implication was clear. Harmon's connection to Sokolov might prove valuable if complications arose, but it also placed both men in potentially compromising positions if they encountered each other in an operational context. There's one more element you need to be aware of, Wilson continued, his voice dropping slightly. We have indications that certain elements within our own command structure view the avalanche deployment as an opportunity to gather critical intelligence on the system's operational parameters through direct observation. Direct observation, Harmon questioned? You mean deliberate provocation to trigger a demonstration? Wilson's silence was answer enough. Adams looked distinctly uncomfortable. That would be insanely reckless, Harmon stated flatly, especially given what we know about the system's technical limitations and potential for friendly fire incidents. Not everyone has access to that assessment, Wilson replied carefully. Compartmentalization works in both directions, Lieutenant. Some operational planners may be working with incomplete information, or deliberately ignoring it to advance their own agendas, just as Kuznetsov was doing on the Soviet side. The parallel was disturbing, a mirror image of military hardliners on both sides pushing toward confrontation while reasonable voices were marginalized or ignored. What exactly are you telling me? Harmon asked, looking between the two officers. Adams answered, his tone measured. We're telling you to be exceptionally vigilant during Tuesday's deployment. Report everything through proper channels, but he hesitated, choosing his words with care. Be aware that standard protocols may not account for all the variables in play. It was as close to an official warning about potential friendly fire risk as Adams could provide without directly questioning his superiors. Harmon understood the subtext, watched not only for threats from the Soviet side, but also for potentially dangerous decisions from their own chain of command. I understand, sir, he replied. My crew will maintain maximum situational awareness. After the briefing concluded, Harmon found himself walking alongside Wilson toward the parking area, both men silent until they were well away from headquarters. There's a faction that wants to see Avalanche in action, Wilson said quietly once they were alone. They believe the intelligence value outweighs the diplomatic risks of a provocation. And the potential casualties? Harmon asked sharply. What's their calculation on acceptable losses? Wilson's expression hardened. War is a numbers game, Lieutenant. Always has been. Some officers reach a level where individual lives become statistical inputs, rather than men with names and families. He stopped, turning to face Harmon directly. That's why officers like you matter, because you haven't forgotten that distinction. The unexpected statement hinted at depths to Wilson that Harmon hadn't previously perceived. Perhaps the intelligence officer wasn't as coldly calculating as he appeared. What would you have me do if I observed preparations for a deliberate provocation? Harmon asked directly. Wilson's response was measured. Use your judgment, Lieutenant. The same judgment that took you across the border to save Sokolov's crew. He paused. Just remember that sometimes preventing a battle serves your country better than winning one. With that cryptic advice, Wilson departed, leaving Harmon to contemplate the complex ethical landscape he now navigated. Military duty demanded obedience to orders and chain of command, but higher duties to humanity and to the fundamental security interests of his nation might demand different choices if those orders threatened to trigger an unnecessary conflict. As he prepared his crew for the Tuesday deployment, Harmon felt the weight of those competing responsibilities bearing down upon him. Whatever happened in the coming days would test not only his tactical skills, but also his moral compass, in ways his training had never anticipated. Chapter 6, The Borderline of Loyalty. Dawn on Tuesday broke with unnatural clarity, the sky a crystalline blue unmarred by clouds. Perfect visibility stretched across the border regions as Harmon's platoon moved into position at observation point Echo 9, a ridgeline offering commanding views of the valley approaches from the Soviet sector. Almost too perfect, Miller commented as he calibrated his optics. Like the weather itself is conspiring to give us front-row seats to whatever's coming. Harmon shared the sentiment. The absence of weather obstacles meant maximum effective range for observation, but also removed any natural concealment that might have provided additional security for their position. They were exposed, as were the Soviet forces deploying across the border. By 0730, their observation confirmed intelligence reports of substantial Soviet armor movements. Multiple T-62 units had established a security perimeter along their side of the border, with additional forces continuing to arrive from staging areas further east. The precision of the deployments and the presence of senior officer vehicles suggested this was no routine exercise. Judgment 3-3 to Judgment Actual, Harmon reported, observing deployment patterns consistent with preparations for major demonstration or forward positioning. No sign yet of special equipment transports. Copy 3-3, came the terse reply. Continue observation. Be advised, additional NATO assets are moving into position for comprehensive monitoring. Those additional assets soon became apparent as the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors echoed across the valley. Two OH-58 Kiowa observation helicopters appeared, maintaining NATO airspace but flying provocatively close to the border, their surveillance equipment obviously directed at the Soviet deployments. That's going to stir the hornet's nest, Rodriguez observed grimly. He wasn't wrong. Within minutes, Soviet air defense radars activated, painting the helicopters with targeting systems, though holding fire. The electronic warning was clear. Approach any closer, and consequences would follow. The helicopters maintained their position, continuing their surveillance pattern just inside NATO territory. It was a deliberate provocation, an attempt to force the Soviets to either reveal more about their activities or escalate the situation. At 0845, the first evidence of the avalanche system appeared. Three large transport vehicles accompanied by specialized engineering equipment entered the security perimeter established by the T-62 units. Even at this distance, Harmon could identify the distinctive shape of heavy power generation equipment being offloaded and positioned. Judgment 3-3 to Judgment Actual confirmed arrival of suspected avalanche support equipment, three transport vehicles consistent with weapons platform carriers. They appear to be establishing a forward operating position approximately 1 kilometer from the border. Copy 3-3. Maintain observation and standby for additional instructions. The calm, almost routine nature of the response contrasted sharply with the gravity of what they were witnessing. The Soviets were effectively deploying a revolutionary weapon system directly adjacent to the NATO border in unprecedented proximity to Western forces. Through his high-powered optics, Harmon scanned the T-62 units establishing the security cordon. It took several minutes of careful observation, but eventually he located what he was looking for: Sokolov's tank, identifiable by its unit markings and position in the formation. The Soviet officer's presence confirmed Wilson's intelligence and added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. Contact, Miller reported suddenly. Large vehicle emerging from transport carrier. Configuration matches avalanche profile from previous observation. The massive weapons platform was now clearly visible, its distinctive elongated hull and specialized turret housing unmistakable even at this distance. Support crews worked with practiced efficiency, connecting power cables and deploying the radar arrays that form part of its targeting system. They're setting up for a demonstration, Harmon concluded, observing the methodical preparation. But what's the target? His question was answered minutes later when several older T-55 tanks were positioned at varying distances from the avalanche system, clearly intended as test targets. The positioning was deliberate, creating a demonstration range that showcased the weapon's effective radius while remaining entirely within Soviet territory. Judgment Actual to all Judgment units, the radio crackled. Be advised, Command has authorized aerial reconnaissance platform to transit border vicinity for enhanced observation. Maintain your positions and continue reporting. Harmon felt a surge of alarm. Aerial reconnaissance platform was almost certainly a reference to a specialized aircraft equipped for electronic intelligence gathering. If it approached too closely to the avalanche system during active testing, Sir, Rodriguez interrupted his thoughts. SIGINT reports Soviet command frequencies just went to combat alert status. They're tracking our reconnaissance aircraft and issuing warnings. Before Harmon could respond, a new aircraft appeared from the western approach, a modified EC-130 with distinctive electronic warfare equipment protruding from its fuselage. The aircraft maintained NATO airspace but began flying a pattern that would bring it within theoretical range of the avalanche system sensors, apparently attempting to gather electronic intelligence on the weapon's emissions. They're deliberately provoking a response, Harmon said quietly, understanding now what Wilson had warned about. Someone in the NATO command structure had decided the intelligence value of observing avalanche in operation outweighed the risks of escalation. Across the border, the Soviet forces reacted with predictable alarm. Additional air defense systems activated, and the security cordon around the avalanche platform tightened. Through his optics, Harmon could see frantic activity around the weapon system itself, suggesting hasty preparation for either demonstration or defensive activation. Judgment 3-3 to Judgment Actual. Soviet forces appear to be accelerating their timeline in response to our aerial reconnaissance. Request immediate withdrawal of aircraft to prevent potential escalation. Judgment. Actual copies your concern, came the maddeningly calm reply. Aerial assets are operating under separate command authority. Maintain your position and continue reporting. Separate command authority. The aircraft wasn't responding to the same chain of command as ground forces, which explained the seemingly contradictory approaches to the situation. Someone at a higher level had authorized the provocative aerial surveillance, despite the risks it created for units on the ground. The next 30 minutes unfolded with the inexorable tension of a wound spring approaching its breaking point. The EC-130 continued its intelligence gathering pattern, each pass bringing it closer to the edge of NATO airspace. Soviet air defense radars tracked it continuously, while the avalanche system appeared to be reaching operational status, its power generators now humming at full capacity. Through it all, Harmon observed Sokolov's tank, noting its position had shifted slightly, moving toward the outer perimeter of the security cordon rather than maintaining close proximity to the avalanche platform. Was the Soviet officer creating distance intentionally, knowing the weapon's potential for indiscriminate effects? At 0937, the situation escalated dramatically. The EC-130 executed a turn that momentarily brought it closer to the border than previous passes, though still within NATO airspace. In response, the avalanche system's targeting arrays visibly activated, rotating to track the aircraft. They're powering up the weapon, Miller reported tensely. Energy signature increasing rapidly. Judgment 3 to Judgment Actual. Avalanche system appears to be activating targeting systems. Strongly recommend immediate withdrawal of aerial assets from border vicinity. This time there was no response from command. Either communications had been compromised, or someone had decided to maintain the provocation despite the escalating danger. Harmon made a split-second decision. Rodriguez, direct channel to the EC-130 now. Breaking protocol, Rodriguez configured their radio to broadcast directly on the aircraft's frequency. EC-130, this is Judgment 3-3 ground observation. Soviet-directed energy weapon is powering up and targeting your position. Immediate withdrawal recommended. Repeat, immediate withdrawal. For several agonizing seconds, there was no response or change in the aircraft's flight path. Then abruptly, it banked away from the border, increasing altitude and distance from the avalanche system. The relief was palpable but short-lived. Across the border, the avalanche weapon remained powered up, its targeting systems now swiveling toward the positioned T-55 targets. The demonstration would proceed despite the provocative NATO surveillance. What happened next occurred with such rapidity that later accounts would struggle to establish the precise sequence of events. The avalanche system discharged, its effect invisible to the naked eye, but evident in the immediate catastrophic failure of the closest T-55 tank. Smoke poured from the engine compartment, followed seconds later by secondary explosions as ammunition cooked off inside the turret. But something went wrong. Instead of affecting only the designated target, the weapon's effect appeared to propagate beyond its intended range. Two T-62s in the security cordon suddenly exhibited similar symptoms, engine fires followed by ammunition detonation. One of them was positioned perilously close to the avalanche platform itself. System malfunction, Miller reported with clinical detachment despite the chaos unfolding before them. Exactly what Sokolov warned about. The weapon can't discriminate between targets and friendly forces. Through his optics, Harmon watched as panic spread through the Soviet deployment. Officers were gesturing frantically, tank commanders ordering immediate withdrawal from the affected area. The avalanche platform itself appeared to be experiencing technical difficulties, with emergency shutdown procedures visibly underway. And in the midst of this chaos, Harmon spotted Sokolov's tank moving with purpose, not retreating from the danger zone, but advancing toward the stricken T-62s, positioning itself to assist the crews attempting to escape their damaged vehicles. It was the border crossing in reverse, Sokolov risking himself to save fellow soldiers from a danger created by his own side's technology. The parallel was not lost on Harmon. "Sir," Rodriguez interrupted urgently. "SIGINT reports Soviet command is issuing emergency shutdown orders for the avalanche system, but the platform is not responding to commands. It appears to be maintaining power levels despite the shutdown attempt." The implications were terrifying. If the weapons control systems had been compromised by the malfunction, its effects could continue to propagate unpredictably, potentially reaching across the border into NATO territory. "Judgment 3-3 to all judgment units," Harmon broadcast, abandoning protocol in favor of clear warning. "Soviet weapons test has experienced critical malfunction. All units maintain maximum distance from border zone. Potential for cross-border effects." Even as he issued the warning, Harmon watched Sokolov's tank reach one of the damaged T-62s. The Soviet officer emerged from his turret hatch, directly exposing himself to danger as he helped evacuate crew members from the stricken vehicle. It was an act of courage that transcended political boundaries, a purely human response to fellow soldiers in peril. And it was about to cost him dearly. Without warning, the avalanche platform discharged again, this time with visibly different effect. A visible distortion wave, like heat shimmer but more pronounced, propagated outward from the weapon. When it reached Sokolov's position, the tank's electrical systems appeared to fail instantly. The vehicle went dark, its engine dying mid-operation. Through his optics, Harmon could see Sokolov collapsing on the turret, either unconscious or worse. The other crew members who had exited their vehicles similarly dropped where they stood, suggesting some kind of neurological effect from the weapon discharge. "My God," Miller whispered. "It affects human nervous systems too." The discharge wave continued expanding, losing power with distance, but maintaining enough energy to disable two more Soviet vehicles before dissipating. It had stopped well short of the border, but the demonstration was clear. The avalanche system represented a threat to anyone within its effective radius, regardless of nationality. "Judgment actual to all units," the radio finally crackled to life. "Situation across border classified as possible strategic incident. All units maintain positions but prepare for immediate withdrawal on command. Aerial assets are being withdrawn from the region." Too late, Harmon thought bitterly. The provocation had already triggered exactly the kind of incident it should have been trying to prevent. And now Sokolov, who had warned them about this very possibility, was potentially dead or severely injured as a result. As Soviet emergency response vehicles rushed into the affected area, Harmon continued to observe through his optics, focusing on Sokolov's position. Medical personnel had reached him and appeared to be providing treatment, though the distance made it impossible to assess his condition accurately. "Lieutenant," Rodriguez said quietly, "Major Wilson is on a secure channel for you." Harmon switched to the designated frequency, bracing for recrimination over his unauthorized warning to the EC-130. "Harmon, this is Wilson. We've been monitoring your assessment of the situation." "Complete failure of the avalanche control system, sir," Harmon replied crisply. "The weapon discharged beyond its intended parameters and appears to have affected not only electronic systems, but personnel as well. Soviet command has lost operational control of the platform, at least temporarily." "And Sokolov?" "Directly affected by the discharge. Medical personnel are attending to him now, but his condition is unknown." Harmon paused. He was attempting to assist crews from disabled vehicles when he was hit. Exactly the kind of humanitarian action he was warning might be compromised by premature deployment. Wilson was silent for a moment. "The provocation from our side was unauthorized at this command level. Someone higher up decided the intelligence value was worth the risk." It was as close to an apology as the intelligence officer could offer. Harmon accepted it with a grunt of acknowledgement, his attention still focused on the unfolding situation across the border. "What happens now, sir?" he asked. "Now we deal with the diplomatic fallout," Wilson replied grimly, "and hope this incident convinces both sides that the avalanche system isn't ready for deployment." He paused. "Your platoon will be recalled within the hour. There may be questions about your direct communication with the EC-130. I'll handle those." Harmon appreciated the support, though it did little to alleviate his concern for Sokolov. The Soviet officer had risked everything to prevent exactly this kind of incident, only to become its victim when others ignored his warnings. As the situation across the border stabilized, with the avalanche platform finally powered down, an emergency response in full swing, Harmon couldn't shake the feeling that they'd all been manipulated pieces moved around a board by players far removed from the consequences of their decisions. Hardliners on both sides had pushed for confrontation, using dedicated officers like himself and Sokolov as expendable assets in their larger games of geopolitical chess. The recall order came at 1100 hours, directing all observation units to withdraw to base for comprehensive debriefing. As Steel Justice began its return journey, Harmon took one final look through his optics at the Soviet side. The Avalanche platform was being loaded back onto its transport vehicle, its deployment clearly terminated following the malfunction. Whether this represented a temporary setback or a more significant reevaluation of the system's readiness remained to be seen. More importantly, he caught a glimpse of a medical evacuation helicopter lifting off from the site where Sokolov had fallen. The Soviet officer's fate unknown, but his impact undeniable. His warnings had been validated in the most dramatic possible fashion, potentially altering the strategic calculations of both superpowers regarding the deployment of this new weapon. "Sir," Miller said as they continued their withdrawal, "for what it's worth, I think you made the right calls today, both warning the aircraft and making sure everyone knew what was happening." Rodriguez nodded in agreement. Some orders need to be questioned when lives are at stake, on both sides. Their support meant more to Harmon than they could know. In a military structure built on hierarchy and obedience, having crew members who understood the complex moral calculus of their profession was invaluable. "Let's just hope the lessons from today aren't forgotten by the time the next crisis emerges," Harmon replied, his thoughts still with Sokolov and the parallel journeys they had both undertaken trying to prevent catastrophe from within systems that sometimes seemed designed to create it. As they approached the base, Harmon noticed unusual activity. Military police vehicles positioned at the entrance, senior officers gathered outside headquarters. Something significant had occurred beyond the avalanche incident. "Judgment 3-3. Proceed directly to debriefing zone Alpha upon arrival," the radio instructed. "Lieutenant Harmon is to report immediately to Colonel Bennett." The tone suggested urgency beyond standard post-mission procedures. Harmon felt a prickle of unease. Had his actions during the crisis triggered more serious consequences than Wilson had implied? Upon arrival, he was immediately escorted to a secure conference room where Colonel Bennett waited alongside Major Adams and two unfamiliar officers bearing insignia of the Joint Chiefs Strategic Assessment Group. "Lieutenant Harmon," Bennett began without preamble, "approximately 30 minutes ago, we received a high-priority communication from Soviet High Command through diplomatic back channels. They've requested a direct officer exchange meeting regarding today's incident, specifically naming you as the American representative they wish to speak with." Harmon's surprise must have been evident, for Bennett continued, "Apparently, Lieutenant Sokolov regained consciousness long enough to insist on your involvement before being evacuated to a military hospital in East Berlin. He claimed you possess contextual understanding, essential to preventing misinterpretation of technical failures." The formal phrasing sounded exactly like Sokolov, diplomatic yet precise, creating an opportunity while maintaining plausible deniability. "The request has been approved at the highest levels," one of the strategic assessment officers added. "You'll depart for Berlin within the hour. This meeting represents a potential breakthrough in managing the fallout from today's incident." As the briefing continued, outlining the parameters of this unprecedented direct communication, Harmon reflected on the strange bond that had formed between himself and Sokolov. Two officers from opposing sides of the Iron Curtain, united by a shared commitment to preventing the very conflict their nations prepared for daily. The borderline between loyalty to one's nation and loyalty to humanity's broader interests was rarely clear-cut in the shadow world of the Cold War. But sometimes, as today had proven, crossing that line became not just necessary, but vital to preserving the peace that both sides claimed to seek. Berlin wore its division like an open wound. The wall cutting through its heart served as a concrete manifestation of the ideological chasm separating East from West. Lieutenant James Harmon gazed at it through the rain-streaked window of the diplomatic vehicle, transporting him from Tempelhof Airport to the designated meeting site at Checkpoint Charlie. Though only hours had passed since the avalanche incident, the diplomatic machinery of both superpowers had moved with unprecedented speed to arrange this meeting. The gravity of the situation had temporarily bulldozed the bureaucratic obstacles that typically delayed such interactions. When weapons capable of altering the strategic balance malfunctioned spectacularly, even the most rigid systems found flexibility. The American delegation awaiting Harmon at the checkpoint facility was small but weighted with authority. Ambassador Keller from the State Department stood alongside General Whitfield, the NATO Deputy Commander for European Operations. Major Wilson was there too, his expression betraying nothing as Harmon approached. "Lieutenant," the general greeted him with a firm handshake. "I've been briefed on your prior interactions with Lieutenant Sokolov. We're counting on that rapport to facilitate a productive exchange." "Yes, sir," Harmon replied, carefully neutral. "Though I should note that my previous conversations with Lieutenant Sokolov were limited and largely informal." "Sometimes informal connections yield the most valuable results," Ambassador Keller observed. His diplomatic experience showed in his measured tone. "The Soviets specifically requested your presence, which suggests Lieutenant Sokolov found your interactions significant, regardless of their formal status." Wilson took Harmon aside while the senior officials conferred. "The situation has escalated beyond our initial assessment," he said quietly. "The avalanche malfunction affected 17 Soviet personnel, including Sokolov. 3 are dead, 8 seriously injured with uncertain prognosis. It's being characterized within their system as a catastrophic technical failure, but elements within the Soviet military are already suggesting Western electronic interference." Harmon processed this disturbing update. "Interference, we both know that's not what happened. What we know and what serves certain political narratives aren't always aligned," Wilson replied grimly. "Kuznetsov's faction is attempting to deflect blame for their premature deployment by suggesting Western sabotage. If that narrative gains traction, we could face a significant escalation in tensions." "And Sokolov, you mentioned he was injured. Stable but serious condition. Neurological effects from the discharge. The fact that he regained consciousness long enough to request your involvement suggests he's fighting to ensure the truth doesn't get buried beneath political convenience." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the Soviet delegation. Through the facility's windows, Harmon observed 3 staff cars with diplomatic flags pulling up to the checkpoint. The delegation that emerged was larger than the American contingent, suggesting either greater concern or a desire to project authority. An older man in a general's uniform led the group, his chest heavy with decorations. Beside him walked a civilian whose impeccable suit and watchful eyes marked him as KGB rather than diplomatic corps. The third figure drew Harmon's full attention, a medical officer supporting a uniformed man who moved with obvious difficulty despite his attempts to maintain military bearing. Lieutenant Viktor Sokolov had clearly insisted on attending despite his injuries. His normally confident posture was compromised by evident pain, his face pale and drawn beneath the bandage covering the left side of his head. But his eyes remained sharp and determined as they swept the room, finding Harmon's gaze and holding it for a significant moment. The formalities of introduction proceeded with rigid protocol, names and ranks exchanged with precise courtesy that did nothing to disguise the underlying tension. General Baranov, the Soviet military representative, spoke passable English with a heavy accent. The KGB officer, introduced only as Comrade Petrov, remained silent, evaluating the Americans with calculated neutrality. When Sokolov was introduced, he straightened despite obvious discomfort. "Lieutenant Viktor Sokolov, Technical Liaison for Experimental Systems Evaluation," he stated, his English deliberate but clear. The title was almost certainly a cover, providing him with plausible reason to discuss the avalanche system without acknowledging his direct involvement in the incident. The delegations were escorted to a conference room that straddled the border. Half in West Berlin, half in East, deliberately designed to ensure neither side could claim home field advantage. The room had witnessed countless tense exchanges throughout the Cold War, its walls absorbing decades of carefully worded threats and diplomatic obfuscation. Ambassador Keller opened the proceedings with practiced diplomatic language, expressing mutual concern regarding the technical incident and shared commitment to preventing misunderstandings that could lead to unintended escalation. The carefully sanitized phrasing stripped the event of its true significance, a catastrophic failure of an experimental weapons system that had killed Soviet personnel and demonstrated the dangers of deploying untested technology in proximity to the border. General Baranov responded with equal diplomatic care, though Harmon detected an underlying tension in his delivery. The general characterized the incident as an unfortunate technical malfunction during a routine systems evaluation, but made no reference to the unauthorized nature of the deployment or Kuznetsov's role in accelerating the testing schedule. Throughout these opening exchanges, Sokolov remained silent, his attention focused on maintaining his composure against obvious physical distress. The medical officer beside him occasionally checked his pulse with professional discretion, his concern evident despite his attempted neutrality. After the formal statements concluded, General Whitfield directed the discussion toward technical specifics. Our observation suggests a cascade failure in the avalanche system's targeting discrimination protocols. We would appreciate the Soviet delegation's assessment of the technical factors involved. The question hung in the air for several seconds. Baranov glanced at the KGB officer, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Our preliminary analysis indicates an unexpected interaction between the system's primary emitter and secondary power regulation components, Baranov stated carefully. The exact cause remains under investigation. It was deliberately vague, revealing nothing about the system's actual capabilities or the true nature of the malfunction. Harmon noticed Sokolov's jaw tighten slightly, his discomfort now seemingly as much from the incomplete explanation as from his physical condition. Ambassador Keller pressed gently. We understand that personnel were affected by the system discharge. This suggests capabilities beyond conventional electronic warfare applications. In the interest of preventing future incidents, more specific technical information would be valuable. Another careful silence descended. This time Sokolov shifted in his seat, drawing attention. When he spoke, his voice was strained but determined. With the general's permission, he began, looking to Baranov, who gave a reluctant nod. I can provide relevant technical context as I was present during the incident and have familiarity with the system's operational parameters. All eyes turned to the injured lieutenant. The KGB officer's expression sharpened, but he made no move to intervene. The avalanche system, Sokolov continued, utilizes a directed energy emission designed to disrupt electronic systems through focused electromagnetic pulses. However, the secondary effect on neurological functions was not intended. It resulted from inadequate field shielding that allowed harmonic resonance between the primary emission and auxiliary power systems. He paused, gathering strength before continuing. Our technical assessment had previously identified this potential vulnerability. The recommendations included additional shielding protocols and extensive field testing at remote locations before deployment in proximity to personnel or border regions. The statement was masterfully constructed. Without directly criticizing his superiors or mentioning Kuznetsov by name, Sokolov had confirmed that the deployment had proceeded despite known safety concerns, precisely what he had warned Harmon about in their previous meeting. These technical recommendations were proceeding through appropriate review channels, Sokolov added, his gaze briefly meeting Harmon's. The accelerated field demonstration schedule may have preceded completion of this review process. General Baranov's expression hardened, but he did not contradict the lieutenant. The KGB officer made a note in a small book, his expression unreadable. Lieutenant Harmon, Ambassador Keller said, turning the focus to the American side, given your proximity to the incident, would you share your observations regarding the system's effects? Harmon understood the delicate position. His response needed to acknowledge what they had witnessed without revealing the extent of American intelligence about the avalanche system prior to the incident. Our observation confirms Lieutenant Sokolov's assessment, he stated carefully. The system discharge appeared to affect a wider radius than intended, with impacts on both electronic systems and personnel. The secondary effects seemed to propagate beyond the primary target zone, suggesting precisely the kind of harmonic resonance Lieutenant Sokolov described. As he spoke, Harmon maintained eye contact with Sokolov, whose subtle nod confirmed they were establishing a shared factual foundation while avoiding politically sensitive details. Our technical teams noted that such effects would be difficult to control in fluid battlefield conditions, Harmon continued, potentially affecting forces on both sides of any conflict. This raises significant questions about the system's suitability for deployment in border regions. The observation landed precisely as intended. Without directly accusing the Soviets of recklessness, Harmon had reinforced Sokolov's point about the premature deployment while emphasizing the mutual risks such systems posed. General Whitfield built on this foundation. Given these shared technical concerns, we believe this incident highlights the need for greater communication regarding developmental systems with strategic implications. Perhaps some form of mutual notification protocol for testing activities within a defined proximity to the border. It was a diplomatic opening, a suggestion of arms control measures specific to advanced systems like Avalanche without explicitly demanding Soviet concessions. To Harmon's surprise, General Baranov did not immediately reject the proposal. Such protocols would require careful consideration regarding scope and verification methods, he said cautiously. However, preventing technical incidents that could be misinterpreted as provocations serves the interests of all parties. The conversation continued along these lines for nearly an hour, gradually establishing a framework for potential future discussions regarding notification and safety parameters for advanced weapons testing. Throughout, Sokolov contributed technical details that systematically reinforced the dangers of premature deployment, while Harmon provided complementary observations that supported these assessments without revealing prior intelligence. Their unspoken coordination did not go unnoticed. The KGB officer watched the interaction with increasing attention, his eyes moving between the two lieutenants with analytical precision. As the formal meeting concluded, Ambassador Keller suggested a brief recess before the final procedural discussions. Perhaps our technical specialist could confer directly on certain parameters while we address the diplomatic language, he proposed smoothly. General Baranov hesitated, then nodded. Lieutenant Sokolov can provide necessary technical details, with Comrade Petrov present, of course. The arrangement gave Harmon and Sokolov a semi-private conversation, albeit under the watchful eyes of the KGB officer who positioned himself close enough to overhear while maintaining a pretense of distance. As they moved to a small side table with technical diagrams, Sokolov's composure briefly faltered. He steadied himself against the table, his breathing labored. "You should be in a hospital," Harmon said quietly. "There will be time for recovery later," Sokolov replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some matters cannot wait." Under the guise of reviewing technical specifications, Sokolov slid a diagram toward Harmon. The Avalanche deployment was not the only initiative advancing ahead of schedule. There are 3 additional platforms in final preparation, intended for permanent forward positioning along the Central European corridor. The revelation sent a chill through Harmon. A single Avalanche system had proven catastrophically dangerous. 3 more, positioned for potential operational use, represented a dramatic escalation. "Kuznetsov?" he asked quietly. Sokolov gave a minimal nod. The incident has not deterred his faction. Instead, they are characterizing it as proof of the system's potential, requiring only technical refinements. They argue that Western reaction to the demonstration proves its strategic value. But the casualties, the technical failures, are being reframed as necessary sacrifices for strategic advancement, Sokolov finished grimly. Those who raised objections are being systematically removed from the command structure, including my superior officer who supported the original safety protocols. He turned the diagram slightly, indicating notations along the margin. These are the planned deployment locations and timetable. 3 weeks from now, unless the decisions are reversed at the highest levels. Harmon understood what Sokolov was doing, providing critical intelligence that could be used to generate diplomatic pressure against the deployments. It was a profound risk for the Soviet officer, whose actions could easily be construed as treason if discovered. "Why take this risk?" Harmon asked, keeping his voice low and his expression neutral for the benefit of the watching KGB officer. Sokolov met his gaze directly. "Because I have seen what this system does to human beings. 3 of my men died yesterday. 5 more may never recover normal neurological function, and the technical flaws remain unaddressed." He paused, his determination evident despite his physical weakness. "Some lines should not be crossed, Lieutenant. Not by your side, not by mine." The KGB officer chose that moment to approach, ending their semi-private exchange. "The General requests your return to the main discussion," he stated flatly. As they rejoined the larger group, Harmon carefully secured the annotated diagram inside his briefing materials. The information Sokolov had risked his career and possibly his life to share would need to reach the appropriate channels quickly if it was to have any chance of affecting the deployment timetable. The meeting concluded with formal agreements for continued technical consultation regarding border-adjacent testing protocols. As the delegations prepared to depart, Sokolov approached Harmon one final time, extending his hand in a gesture that appeared merely professional courtesy to observers. "The world is balanced on the edge of a knife, Lieutenant Harmon," he said, his grip firm despite his weakened condition. "It will take men on both sides who can see beyond their own borders to keep it from falling." "I understand," Harmon replied, recognizing the deeper meaning beneath the seemingly philosophical observation. "Recovery well, Lieutenant. Perhaps we'll meet again under better circumstances." Sokolov's faint smile held both doubt and hope. Better circumstances would be welcome, though I suspect our paths are now irrevocably connected through less than ideal ones. As Harmon watched the Soviet delegation depart, Sokolov leaning heavily on the medical officer for support, he felt the weight of the information now in his possession and the responsibility it entailed. The Soviet lieutenant had gambled everything on the belief that Harmon would use this intelligence to prevent a dangerous escalation rather than to seek tactical advantage. It was a trust he could not betray. The American delegation returned to the diplomatic compound in West Berlin, where immediate secure communications with Washington were established. In a private briefing room, Harmon presented the deployment information Sokolov had provided to General Whitfield, Ambassador Keller, and Major Wilson. "If this intelligence is accurate," Whitfield said grimly after examining the annotated diagram, "we're looking at a significant strategic shift in less than a month. Even with the technical flaws, 3 avalanche systems deployed along the central corridor would alter response calculations for any NATO operation." "The timeline matches other intelligence fragments we've been gathering," Wilson confirmed. "But this level of specificity regarding locations and technical readiness exceeds anything we've obtained through conventional channels." Ambassador Keller studied Harmon thoughtfully. "Lieutenant Sokolov provided this information at considerable personal risk. What's your assessment of his motivation?" Harmon chose his words carefully. "I believe he's genuinely concerned about the safety implications of premature deployment. He witnessed firsthand what happened to his own men yesterday. But beyond that, he seems to understand that systems like Avalanche fundamentally destabilize the strategic balance. If both sides begin deploying weapons whose effects can't be reliably controlled or contained," he didn't need to finish the thought. Everyone in the room understood the implications. Weapons that could cascade beyond intended targets created dangers that transcended normal military calculations. "We'll forward this intelligence to Washington immediately," Whitfield decided. "The question becomes how to leverage it without compromising the source." "Diplomatic channels might be most effective," Keller suggested. "A direct communication at the Secretary of State level, indicating awareness of the deployment preparations without specifying how we obtain the information. Combined with international concern about yesterday's incident, it might be enough to force reconsideration at levels above Kuznetsov's influence." Wilson turned to Harmon. "Lieutenant, your interaction with Sokolov has proven remarkably productive. Would you assess him as potentially open to ongoing communication regarding these developments?" The question carried implications beyond the current situation. The intelligence officer was essentially asking if Sokolov could be developed as a long-term asset, a source within the Soviet military system. Harmon considered the question carefully, aware that his answer could significantly impact Sokolov's future. "I believe Lieutenant Sokolov would continue to share information regarding dangerous technological deployments that threaten stability," he replied diplomatically. "But I would characterize his motivation as professional concern for preventing unnecessary conflict rather than any ideological alignment with Western interests." It was an important distinction. Sokolov wasn't betraying his country. He was trying to prevent reckless actions by hardliners within his own system that could lead to catastrophic consequences for all sides. "Noted," Wilson said, seeming to understand the nuance. "For now, we'll focus on the immediate intelligence regarding the planned deployments. You'll be returned to your unit tomorrow, Lieutenant, but remain available for potential follow-up operations." As the briefing concluded, Harmon found himself alone with Wilson for a brief moment. The intelligence officer studied him with that same unreadable expression. "You've handled a complex situation with remarkable judgment, Harmon," he said finally. "Not many lieutenants could navigate these waters without drowning in the cross-currents." "Just trying to prevent unnecessary escalation, sir." "Indeed," Wilson paused. Just remember that while you and Sokolov may share that objective, the systems you both serve don't always prioritize restraint. Be careful about assuming too much common ground with a Soviet officer, regardless of how reasonable he seems. The warning was delivered without hostility, almost as friendly advice from one professional to another. Yet Harmon detected something else beneath the caution, a subtle acknowledgement that sometimes the greatest threats came not from the officially designated enemy, but from within one's own system. I understand the complexities, sir, Harmon replied carefully. Wilson nodded, satisfied. Get some rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. Chapter 8. The Confrontation. True to Wilson's prediction, the next morning brought a rapid evolution of the situation. Harmon was awakened before dawn by an urgent summons to the Secure Communications Center at the diplomatic compound. There he found Wilson already engaged with Washington via encrypted channel, his expression tense as he acknowledged Harmon's arrival. The intelligence you brought back has been validated through satellite surveillance and other sources, Wilson explained after concluding his call. 3 deployment sites are indeed being prepared, matching the location Sokolov identified. However, the timeline appears to be accelerating. Preparation activities suggest deployment within days, not weeks. That contradicts the schedule Sokolov provided, Harmon noted with concern. Yes, which suggests either he had incomplete information or more likely Kuznetsov's faction is moving even faster than the official timetable in response to yesterday's incident. Wilson's expression was grim. They may be attempting to establish operational positions before diplomatic interventions can be mobilized. The implications were disturbing. The accelerated timeline significantly reduced options for preventing the deployments through normal diplomatic channels, which typically moved with deliberate caution. Washington has authorized a direct approach, Wilson continued. Secretary of State Pullman will speak with his Soviet counterpart within the hour, explicitly addressing our awareness of the deployment preparations and expressing grave concern about the potential for further incidents like yesterday's malfunction. Will that be enough to stop it? Harmon asked skeptically. Unlikely on its own, Wilson admitted, which is why we're simultaneously pursuing multiple pressure points. Before he could elaborate, a communications officer entered with an urgent message. Wilson read it quickly, his expression shifting to something approaching surprise. It seems we have an unexpected development. Lieutenant Sokolov has requested another meeting through East German intermediaries. Specifically with you, Lieutenant Harmon, without the full delegations present. Harmon's surprise matched Wilson's. Given Sokolov's physical condition yesterday, another meeting so soon seemed unlikely, and requesting a more private conversation significantly increased the risks for the Soviet officer. Did he indicate the purpose? Harmon asked. Only that he has time-sensitive, technical information relevant to preventing misinterpretation of system parameters. Very formal, very bureaucratically correct. Wilson handed the message to Harmon, and almost certainly not the real reason he wants to talk. He's taking an enormous risk, Harmon observed, studying the carefully worded request. Yes, which means whatever he wants to communicate must be critically important. Wilson made a quick decision. The request has been approved through our channels. The meeting is set for a 900 at a neutral location, a cafeteria at Humboldt University's International Studies Building, East German territory, but considered academic neutral ground for certain exchanges. The location was significant, an environment with civilian witnesses where neither side could easily take coercive action, but which offered enough ambient noise and activity to make electronic surveillance difficult. He'll almost certainly be accompanied by handlers, Wilson cautioned. Probably the same KGB officer from yesterday, possibly others. They'll maintain distance, but we'll be watching every interaction. Keep the conversation focused on technical matters as much as possible to maintain the pretext. And the real objective? Harmon asked directly. Whatever Sokolov risked his career to tell you, Wilson replied. Just make sure you remember every word. 4 hours later, Harmon sat at a corner table in the university cafeteria, a cup of cooling coffee before him, as he observed the morning routine of students and faculty. The atmosphere was notably different from the rigid formality of yesterday's checkpoint, meeting an international academic environment where East and West intermixed within carefully defined parameters. Sokolov arrived precisely at the appointed time, accompanied by the same KGB officer who had observed their previous conversation. The Soviet lieutenant moved with slightly more ease than yesterday, though still with evident care. His uniform had been replaced by civilian clothes, a concession to the university setting that also served to downplay the official nature of the meeting. As expected, the KGB officer positioned himself at a table some distance away, close enough to observe but not to overhear normal conversation amid the cafeteria's ambient noise. Lieutenant Harmon, Sokolov greeted him with formal correctness as he took the seat opposite. "Thank you for agreeing to this consultation." "Of course," Harmon replied with an equal formality. "Technical clarity serves everyone's interests." They maintained the pretense of technical discussion for several minutes, Sokolov producing engineering diagrams with handwritten notations regarding power systems and emission parameters. To any observer, they appeared to be two technical specialists discussing complex system specifications, occasionally pointing to details on the diagrams. Only when the cafeteria's noise level increased with the arrival of a large group of students did Sokolov shift to the true purpose of their meeting. "Your government has initiated diplomatic communications regarding the deployments," he said quietly, his attention seemingly focused on the diagrams. "It is having effect at certain levels, but Kuznetsov has accelerated the timetable in response." "We've observed the acceleration," Harmon confirmed, maintaining the appearance of discussing the documents. "The deployment appears imminent." "It is, within 48 hours. Sokolov turned a page in the technical documents, using the motion to mask his intensified focus. "But there is a more immediate concern. Kuznetsov has authorized a final field test today at the original test site. Full power demonstration, scheduled for 1400 hours. Harmon felt a surge of alarm that he carefully kept from his expression. After yesterday's failures? That seems extraordinarily reckless. It is. But Kuznetsov is desperate to demonstrate system viability before diplomatic interventions can halt the broader deployment. Sokolov's expression remained neutral despite the urgency of his words. The test parameters include maximum power settings that exceed the safety thresholds our engineers established. The potential radius of effect could extend to NATO observation posts. The implication was clear. If NATO personnel were affected by the test, even indirectly, it could trigger a significant escalation, potentially creating exactly the crisis that would justify Kuznetsov's push for accelerated deployment of advanced weapon systems. "This information needs to reach your command immediately," Sokolov continued. "All personnel should be withdrawn to minimum safe distance 20 kilometers from the border adjacent to the test site." "I'll ensure it's communicated," Harmon promised. "But what about your side, the technical crews, the security personnel?" A shadow passed over Sokolov's face. "Precautionary measures have been reduced in favor of expedited testing. The risks are being systematically minimized in briefings to operational personnel." "They're lying to their own people," Harmon translated. "Certain facts are being selectively presented," Sokolov corrected diplomatically, aware of the KGB observer. "I have attempted to ensure my own technical staff understands the proper safety parameters, but my authority has been limited since yesterday's incident." Harmon understood the subtext. Sokolov was likely under suspicion already, his warnings about the previous test failure having proven accurate in ways that embarrassed his superiors. His ability to protect his own personnel was being systematically undermined. "There's something else you should know," Sokolov added, his voice dropping further. "Kuznetsov has positioned the test as a direct response to alleged NATO electronic interference during yesterday's demonstration. The narrative being established characterizes Western actions as provocative and demanding technological countermeasures. It was a dangerous escalation of rhetoric, laying groundwork for justifying whatever consequences might emerge from today's test. If NATO personnel were affected, it could be framed as appropriate response to prior Western aggression rather than as a reckless technological failure. The test cannot be prevented through normal channels at this point, Sokolov concluded grimly. The best outcome is minimizing potential casualties by ensuring adequate distance for all personnel. As he spoke, Sokolov subtly adjusted one of the technical diagrams, revealing notations along the margin that hadn't been visible before, exact coordinates for the test site and timing information that would be critical for establishing proper safety perimeters. "I understand," Harmon said, committing the details to memory. "We'll take appropriate precautions." Sokolov met his gaze directly for the first time since sitting down. "There's one final element you should be aware of. I have been reassigned effective immediately following this meeting. Cartographic Support Division, Vladivostok." The implications were clear. Sokolov was being exiled to the furthest reaches of the Soviet Union, far from any influence over the Avalanche program and isolated from potential Western contacts. This meeting was likely his last opportunity to affect the situation. That seems like a waste of your technical expertise, Harmon observed carefully. Perhaps, but reassignment is preferable to alternatives that were considered. Sokolov's expression revealed nothing, but his meaning was clear enough. He had narrowly avoided more severe consequences for his perceived lack of enthusiasm for Kuznetsov's accelerated deployment. Their conversation had extended long enough to potentially raise suspicion from the KGB observer, who had shifted positions slightly for a better view of their interaction. I believe these technical parameters should address the specific concerns raised by your delegation, Sokolov said, smoothly transitioning back to the official pretext for their meeting. Please convey to your superiors that these revised specifications reflect current operational configurations. I'll ensure this information reaches the appropriate technical teams, Harmon replied, gathering the documents with care to preserve the annotated coordinates. They stood, exchanging formal handshakes for the benefit of observers. For a brief moment, Sokolov's carefully maintained professional demeanor softened. Remember what I said about men who see beyond borders, Lieutenant Harmon, he said quietly. They are rarer than anyone admits, but essential in times like these. Safe travels, Lieutenant Sokolov, Harmon replied, understanding this was likely their final meeting. Perhaps history will bring us together again under different circumstances. History rarely arranges comfortable reunions, Sokolov observed with the faintest smile, but I would welcome the exception. With that, he departed, the KGB officer falling into step behind him with practiced discretion. Harmon watched them leave, aware that he had just witnessed an extraordinary act of moral courage, a Soviet officer risking everything to prevent potential casualties on both sides of a conflict that generals and politicians seemed increasingly willing to provoke. Harmon wasted no time delivering Sokolov's warning to the American mission, where it was immediately relayed to NATO command through secure channels. The response was rapid and comprehensive. All observation posts within 30 kilometers of the identified test site were ordered to withdraw to safe distances, with only remote monitoring equipment left in place. By 1300 hours, the repositioning was complete. Harmon found himself at a NATO command center in West Berlin, where he had been summoned to provide direct context for the intelligence he had delivered. Major Wilson was present, along with senior NATO officers responsible for the Berlin corridor. The withdrawal has been executed precisely as you recommended, General Marshall, the senior NATO commander, confirmed. Remote monitoring systems remain active, but all personnel have been pulled back well beyond the 20-kilometer safety perimeter. Soviet communications indicate the test is proceeding on schedule, a signals intelligence officer added. Increased activity at the test site correlates with preparations for a major demonstration. Wilson pulled Harmon aside during a brief pause in the briefing. Sokolov's intelligence has checked out in every verifiable detail, he said quietly. The reassignment to Vladivostok has been confirmed through diplomatic channels. He's being removed from any position of influence regarding the Avalanche program. Because he tried to prevent a potential disaster, Harmon noted with subdued anger. Because he threatened a powerful faction's agenda, Wilson corrected. The same would likely happen on our side to an officer who challenged certain pet projects of politically connected generals. The system doesn't reward those who prioritize safety over strategic advantage, regardless of which flag they serve under. The cynical assessment carried the weight of experience. Harmon had seen enough in recent days to recognize its essential truth, however uncomfortable. What happens after today's test, he asked. If the deployments proceed as planned, then we adjust our strategic posture accordingly, Wilson replied pragmatically, while simultaneously pursuing diplomatic constraints through any available channels. The game continues, Lieutenant. It always does. At precisely 1400 hours, remote sensors detected the energy signature of the avalanche system activating at the test site. The discharge registered on multiple monitoring platforms, its intensity significantly greater than the previous day's demonstration. For several tense minutes, they observed the data streams from remote equipment positioned at various distances from the test site. The effects propagated further than anticipated, with electronic systems experiencing interference at distances well beyond the theoretical maximum range. 22 kilometers, the technical officer announced, reading from the incoming data. Confirmed system effects at 22 kilometers. That's nearly double the projected effective radius from previous assessments. The implications were sobering. Had NATO personnel remained in their original positions, they would have been well within the affected zone. Sokolov's warning had potentially prevented significant casualties in an international incident that could have triggered dangerous escalation. Signal degradation patterns suggest the discharge was not fully controlled, the technical officer continued. We're seeing asymmetric propagation with the effects extending further in some vectors than others, consistent with the harmonic resonance issues identified in yesterday's malfunction. In other words, the same technical flaws remained unaddressed, but the system had been pushed to even higher power levels despite these known risks. Kuznetsov's determination to demonstrate the weapon's potential had overridden basic safety considerations. Any indication of casualties on their side? General Marshall asked grimly. The intelligence officer shook his head. No clear confirmation, but radio traffic suggests medical personnel have been deployed to the test site. Multiple encrypted priority transmissions consistent with casualty reporting protocols. They had sacrificed their own people to prove a point and advance a strategic agenda. The cold calculation behind such a decision disturbed Harmon deeply, though he maintained his professional demeanor as the briefing continued. What about the planned deployments? He asked Wilson quietly. Will this demonstration affect the timeline? That depends on how it's interpreted by their leadership, Wilson replied. If they focus on the extended range rather than the control issues, it could actually accelerate the process. We'll know more in the coming hours as we monitor their deployment preparations. The answer came sooner than expected. Shortly after 1600 hours, satellite imagery revealed the first of the avalanche transport vehicles departing its staging area, heading toward one of the forward deployment sites Sokolov had identified. They're moving ahead, General Marshall observed grimly as the imagery was displayed on the command center's main screen. Despite the technical failures, despite the casualties, they're proceeding with deployment. Kuznetsov must have significant political backing, Wilson noted. This level of persistence, despite documented system failures, suggests support from the highest levels of their defense ministry. Harmon studied the satellite imagery, noting the extensive security cordons surrounding the transport convoy. They're committing fully to this course of action, regardless of the risks. Then we respond accordingly, Marshall stated firmly. Effective immediately, all NATO forces in the Central European corridor will implement electronic warfare countermeasures and maintain maximum safe distance from identified deployment zones. Diplomatic channels will continue pursuing formal protests and demands for technical verification, but we prepare for operational reality. The machinery of strategic response was already in motion on both sides, a dangerous dance of technological escalation driven by hardliners who viewed the risk of conflict as acceptable cost for potential advantage. It was exactly the scenario Sokolov had warned against, unfolding despite their efforts to prevent it. As the command center mobilized to implement the general's directives, Wilson drew Harmon aside one final time. You've been ordered to return to your unit tomorrow, he informed him. The official narrative regarding your involvement these past days will reference technical consultation on border incident protocols. Nothing about specific intelligence or your interactions with Sokolov. Understood, Harmon acknowledged. What about Sokolov? Is there any way to... He let the question hang, unsure exactly what he was asking. To protect him? Wilson finished with a knowing look. No, he made his choices knowing the likely consequences. The best we can do is ensure the intelligence he provided is used effectively to minimize potential conflict. He paused, studying Harmon thoughtfully. You developed a genuine respect for him, didn't you? He was willing to sacrifice his career to prevent unnecessary casualties on both sides, Harmon replied simply. That deserves respect, regardless of uniform. Wilson nodded slowly. Perhaps so. Just remember that such individuals are exceptions, not representatives of the systems they serve. For every Sokolov willing to prioritize human life over ideological advantage, there are dozens of Kuznetsovs who view casualties as acceptable strategic cost. I understand the difference, Harmon assured him. I've seen both types up close now. Good. Wilson extended his hand. You've performed exceptionally under complex circumstances, Lieutenant. I suspect our paths will cross again as this situation evolves. Harmon accepted the handshake, recognizing the sincere professional respect it represented, despite their occasionally divergent perspectives on the events they had navigated together. I'll be where I'm needed, he replied simply. Chapter 9, Steel Legacy. The return to his unit the following day brought Harmon full circle. Steel Justice waited in the motor pool, its familiar silhouette a grounding presence after days of diplomatic complexity. His crew greeted him with evident relief, their questions carefully limited to what they sensed he could appropriately share. Word is you were involved in some high-level technical consultations, Rodriguez ventured, as they prepared the tank for a routine patrol. Anything to do with that Soviet weapon system that malfunctioned? Something like that, Harmon confirmed, maintaining the official narrative. Establishing proper protocols for border-adjacent testing to prevent future incidents. Miller exchanged a meaningful glance with Rodriguez. And the 3 Soviet transport convoys that intelligence says are deploying right now, that related to your consultations too? The question confirmed that information flowed through informal channels almost as efficiently as through official briefings. Tankers talked, intelligence personnel talked, and the reality of the avalanche deployments was becoming common knowledge throughout the forward units. We're implementing appropriate countermeasures, Harmon replied carefully. Electronic warfare defenses, modified patrol parameters. Battalion will brief everyone formally this afternoon. His crew accepted the limited information without pressing further, understanding the constraints of operational security. But as they prepared for patrol, Harmon sensed their unspoken concerns about what these new Soviet deployments might mean for their daily operations along the border. Whatever's out there, we'll handle it, he assured them with quiet confidence. Just maintain proper distances from the identified deployment zones and follow the electronic countermeasure protocols when they're issued. The afternoon briefing confirmed what Harmon already knew. The avalanche systems were being deployed to 3 forward positions along the Central European corridor, creating significant new threats to NATO electronic systems and potentially to personnel as well. Modified patrol routes and enhanced countermeasures would become standard procedure for all units operating in proximity to the deployment zones. What the briefing didn't mention was the human factor behind the intelligence that had allowed these preparations. The Soviet officer who had risked everything to provide warning about the deployments and the final test. Sokolov's contribution would remain hidden, known only to a select few who understood the true sequence of events that had led to this moment. After the briefing, Captain Richards approached Harmon privately. Major Adams filled me in on some aspects of your recent activities, he said with newfound respect in his tone. Seems your understanding of Soviet armor capabilities proved valuable at levels well above our pay grade. Just trying to prevent unnecessary escalation, sir, Harmon replied, echoing the words he had used with Wilson days earlier. Well, it sounds like you did exactly that. Richards handed him a sealed envelope. This came through channels for you, personal correspondence apparently. Harmon accepted the envelope with surprise. It bore no return address, only his name and unit designation in precise handwriting. He waited until he was alone in his quarters before carefully opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing what appeared to be a chess notation, the record of moves from an unfinished game. At the bottom, a brief note in the same meticulous handwriting. Perhaps we can complete this match someday. Until then, maintain appropriate distance from the board edge. V.S. Sokolov had somehow managed to send a final message before his reassignment to Vladivostok. On the surface, it referenced their brief chess game in Berlin and offered innocuous advice to be cautious. But Harmon understood the deeper meaning: maintain safe distance from the avalanche deployment zones, exactly as NATO forces were now being instructed to do. He carefully secured the note in the same wooden box where he kept the other reminders of significant moments from his military career. Someday, perhaps, the full story could be told. For now, it remained one of many classified chapters in the ongoing Cold War, its true significance known only to those directly involved. The following week saw a tense new equilibrium establish itself along the border. NATO forces adjusted their operations to account for the avalanche deployments, maintaining prescribed safe distances while enhancing electronic countermeasures. Soviet forces settled into new security patterns around the deployment sites, their increased presence a visible reminder of the escalated technological standoff. Diplomatic protests continued through official channels with limited effect. The Soviet leadership neither acknowledged the specific nature of the deployments nor responded substantively to concerns about the system's demonstrated technical flaws. The dangerous dance continued, with both sides making strategic adjustments while avoiding direct confrontation. For Harmon and his crew, daily operations took on a heightened significance. Each patrol along the modified routes represented the practical implementation of knowledge gained at tremendous risk by Sokolov, knowledge that had potentially prevented a serious escalation and saved lives on both sides. 1 month after the initial avalanche incident, Harmon received orders transferring him to NATO headquarters in Brussels, where his experience with Soviet armor capabilities and the specific knowledge he had gained during the crisis would contribute to developing long-term countermeasures against directed energy weapons. It represented a significant career advancement, recognition of his handling of complex circumstances under extraordinary pressure. On his final patrol before departure, Harmon guided Steel Justice along the border one last time, maintaining the prescribed safe distance from Soviet territory while observing the now familiar security patterns around the nearest avalanche deployment site. Think they ever fixed the technical flaws in that system? Miller asked as he scanned the Soviet positions through his optics. Probably not completely, Harmon replied. Some design flaws are fundamental to the technology itself. They can mitigate the risks, but never eliminate them entirely. Seems insane to deploy a weapon that might kill your own people, Rodriguez commented. Harmon considered the observation thoughtfully. The military calculus sometimes accepts risks that individual soldiers wouldn't. That's true on both sides. But sometimes individual soldiers have to push back against that calculus, Miller suggested, giving Harmon a knowing look that suggested he understood more about recent events than he had revealed. Sometimes, Harmon acknowledged with a slight smile, when the stakes are high enough. As they completed their patrol route and prepared to return to base, Harmon took a final moment to observe the border landscape, the arbitrary lines separating east from west. Somewhere far to the east, a Soviet lieutenant named Viktor Sokolov was beginning a new assignment in Vladivostok. His career derailed, but his conscience intact. They had both chosen to see beyond the borders their nations had established, choosing to recognize the humanity on the other side and the shared interest in preventing unnecessary conflict. It was a perspective that military systems rarely rewarded, but that humanity desperately needed from those entrusted with the machinery of potential destruction. Steel Justice turned westward, its powerful engine carrying Harmon away from the border he had patrolled for months and toward new responsibilities that would build on the insights gained during this crisis. The tank that had carried him across a forbidden border to save Soviet lives now carried him toward a future shaped by that decisive moment when duty to humanity had transcended duty to orders. The legacy of those choices would continue long after the specific technologies and deployments had become footnotes in military history. In the ongoing struggle between those who saw advantage in escalation and those who recognized the mutual interest in stability, officers like Harmon and Sokolov represented an essential counterbalance, the human perspective that sometimes required crossing borders to preserve the peace they were sworn to defend.